여러분 안녕하십니까? 인사드리겠습니다. 문화
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm your Master of Ceremony for Munhwa Future Report. My name is Juyo. Nice to see you. Thank you so much for being with us today. Marking the 8th anniversary, Munhwa Future Report select most timely issues of our time to create a venue for in-depth discussion on future, garnering attention from many. I express my gratitude for all attendees for your kind participation. Once again, thank you so much for your kind participation. Munhwa Ilbo, seeing the rapid political change in and outside of Korea, carefully select the most noteworthy topics, seeking solutions with subject matter experts, and creating a venue for discourse to make meaningful contribution to the society. The main theme of this year's edition is a trajectory of Trumpism and Korea's choices, the U.S. being center of the global attention, and Trumpism-induced political, economic, and diplomatic landscape changes directly affects the Korean society. I believe that these changes will change how we live in terms of politics, economy, and diplomacy. Today, we are joined by scholars from home and abroad who will be talking about the substances and future of Trumpism and strategies and choices left for Korea. The government, businesses, and civic groups need to collect their wisdoms at this moment, and I hope you find today's occasion meaningful and insightful as well. Today's event is being live broadcasted in our official YouTube webpage. I wish you can stay with us until the very end. Without further ado, I'd like to commence the 2025 Munhwa Future Report.
And yes, together, we will make America great again. I was saved by God to make America great again.
네,
Thank you so much. Munhwa Future Report 2025 main theme was just introduced in the previous video clip. Before we begin, please allow me to introduce VIP guests who are honoring this occasion despite their busy schedule. Please give a big round of applause as I introduce each. Mr. Woo Won-sik, the Speaker of the National Assembly. Thank you. Mr. Kim Byung-gi, Floor Leader of the Democratic Party. Thank you for your presence. Floor Leader Song Won-seok of the People Power Party. Representative Lee Jun-seok of the Reform Party. Chairman Song Il-jong of the National Assembly National Defense Committee. Mr. Shin Sung-bum, Chairman of the National Assembly Intelligence Committee. Mr. Park Soo-yeon, Member of the National Assembly of Democratic Party. Kim Eun-hae, Member of the National Assembly Democratic Party. Lee Gi-hun, Member of the National Assembly from Democratic Party. Chon Ha-ran, Floor Leader of Reform Party. Honorary Chairman Jung Mong-jun of Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Mayor Oh Se-hoon of Seoul Metropolitan City Government. Senior Secretary Lee Gyu-yeon to the President for Public Affairs. President Kim Ki-sik of National Assembly Futures Institute. President Yoon Jin-sik of the Korea International Trade Association. Executive Vice President Park Il-jun of the Korea Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Executive Vice President Lee Dong-gun of the Korea Enterprises Federation. Executive Vice President Oh Gi-ung of Korea Federation of SMEs. President Jo Yong-byung of the Korea Bankers Association. Chairperson Yang Jong-hee of KB Financial Group. Chairperson Jin Ok-dong of Shinhan Financial Group. President Lee Oh-sung of Hana Bank. Chairperson Yu Song-ok of the Institute for National Security Strategy. President Kwon Hyuk-ju of the Korean Institute of Public Administration. Distinguished Fellow Kenneth Weinstein from Hudson Institute. Professor Derry Press of Political Science at Dartmouth University. Professor Francis Fukuyama of Political Science at Stanford University. Professor Kathy Kramer of Political Science at University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dean of Graduate School of International Studies of Yonsei University, Mr. Lee Jung-hoon. President Kim Hyun-wook of Sejong Institute. Director Shin Gi-wook of the Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford University. Professor An Byung-jin of Kyunghee University Global Economy for Future Civilizations. So we are joined by many distinguished guests. Thank you so much for your kind participation. So, Mr. Lee Byung-gyu, the president of the Munhwa Ilbo, will kick off the meeting with the opening remark. Please welcome with a big round of applause.
존경한
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely welcome all of you to the International Forum Culture Future Report 2025. First, let me express my deep gratitude to the speaker, to President Lee Jae-myung, for sending us congratulatory messages today. And also, I'd like to thank Speaker of the National Assembly, Woo Won-sik, and all other distinguished guests here with us today despite their busy schedules. I also extend my sincere gratitude to Kenneth Weinstein, Distinguished Fellow of the Hudson Institute, Daryl Press, Professor of Government at Dartmouth, Francis Fukuyama, Professor of Political Science at Stanford, and Catherine Kramer, Professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And also to those leading the discussions today, Lee Jung-hoon, Dean of the GSIS at Yonsei University, Shin Gi-uk, Director of the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford, Kim Hyun-uk, President of the Sejong Institute, and An Byung-jin, Professor of Global Academy for Future Civilizations at Kyunghee University. This year's forum takes place just 8 months into President Trump's second term and 2 months into the Lee Jae-myung government of Korea. As usual, we have passed spring and endured the heat of summer and reached the doorsteps of autumn. But the time we have lived through this year has been unlike any other. Ladies and gentlemen, following the start of the second Trump term, Korea is facing rapid changes in the international political landscape. Since World War II, the U.S. has been leading the liberal international order. Now, however, strictly based on cost-benefit terms, it is realigning its adversaries and allies. Let alone China, its long-standing allies, Korea and Japan, are slapped with high tariffs and being pressed for political, diplomatic, and economic cooperation. The very foundation of the ROK-US alliance, U.S. forces in Korea's role and scale are also on the negotiating table. Korea must decide how much it will align with the U.S. military and diplomatic strategy of containing China. Thankfully, on the 25th, at the White House in Washington, D.C., the U.S.-Korea summit seems to have been concluded more so successfully. President Lee Jae-myung met with President Trump and said that they were able to see eye to eye on many issues. Domestically, Korea has endured martial law, impeachment, and an early presidential election, among other turbulences. Even the minimum tolerance has disappeared in politics, with good versus evil framing fueling political strife. Political polarization has also led to voter polarization. The public square, once a place for dialogue, has long turned into a battleground of division. Yet, ladies and gentlemen, in Korea's modern history, every crisis has also been an opportunity. Our people have risen anew 100 times. It is under this grave reality that Munhwa Ilbo has chosen this year's theme, the trajectory of Trumpism and Korea's choices. Diagnosing the new international order correctly is Korea's top priority if it is to find a path for renewed progress. With power rivalries among the US, China, Russia, and Japan intensifying, and North Korea's threats escalating, cool-headed analysis and diagnosis are urgently required. This is more important than ever before. This forum will engage distinguished scholars from Korea and abroad to discuss Korea's survival strategy and its path for another leap forward. Munhwa Ilbo will continue to seek solutions to the challenges facing Korea and the world for a better future by hosting these discussions going forward. To ensure that the Cultural Future Report provides constructive and universally relevant insights, we will spare no effort. I ask for your continued interest and encouragement. Thank you.
네,
Yes, thank you, Chairman Lee, for opening the door of the CFR 2025. Next, we'll hear the President's congratulatory address. President Lee had wished to attend today's forum and grace this event, but due to important diplomatic commitments, he was unable to do so, but has instead sent his message. Senior Presidential Secretary for PR Lee Kyu-yeon will read his speech on his behalf. Please welcome him.
네, 국민
I think, as you well may be aware, President is in the U.S. and having a busy schedule on the U.S. soil. So I'm going to read his remark on behalf of President. Munhwa Future Report 2025, congratulations on the opening of this year's edition. I express my gratitude to Chairman Lee Byung-gyu and his staff members for making this meaningful event possible. To grasp the issue of today and to suggest the proper future direction for Korea, the Munhwa Future Report has returned once again this year with a theme, Trajectory of Trumpism and Korea's Choices. The world is currently seeing a massive wave of change. Amid escalating geopolitical tensions and technological hegemony competition, protectionism and self-centered nationalism are intensifying. If we fail to respond appropriately to the rapidly changing international order, the future of our nation will be shaken and the lives of our citizens will be threatened. South Korea stands at a crossroad. Will it overcome the crisis or make a fresh leap forward, or will it continue to stagnate? To overcome the crisis and lead a way in change, we must pull all our national capabilities and make effort on multiple fronts. The government will turn the global complex crisis into an opportunity to maximize national interest through practical diplomacy centered on national interest. Based on the solid ROC-US alliance, we will strengthen cooperation between the ROC and US and Japan and improve relations with neighboring countries. We'll also strive to enhance industrial competitiveness, which is the core of national power, as demonstrated by the shipbuilding industry, which served as a lever in recent tariff negotiation with the United States. Industrial competitiveness has become the source and foundation of national interest. We'll spare no investment in advanced technology industries such as AI and semiconductor, renewable energy, and culture industries for the future. I believe that this will open up new paths for growth and advancement. Once again, congratulate on the opening of the Munhwa Future Report 2025. I hope this event will serve as an opportunity to diagnose the changing international order and explore strategic responses for South Korea to take the lead. I wish all of you here today success and happiness. Thank you very much. 2025, August 26th, President Lee Jae-myung.
네, 대통령.
Thank you. That was a remark from President Mr. Lee Kyu-yeon, Presidential Public Affairs Secretary. Thank you so much. Next is the congratulatory remark from the Speaker of the National Assembly, Woo Won-seok. Please welcome him with a big round of applause. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Woo Won-sik, the Speaker of the National Assembly. This is the 8th birthday of the Munhwa Future Report, and congratulations on the opening of it. I was thinking what would be the best way to congratulate on it, but I brought this lightest suit and necktie to congratulate the successful opening of the forum. Last year, actually, I attended this forum as well to talk about the international order-related issues. And every year, this kind of meaningful event is organized by none other than Chairman Lee Byung-gyu and his staff members, and thank you so much for your hard work. And also, speakers and discussants in and out of Korea, and all the audience, and thank you so much for your kind participation as well. We are living in a world totally different from that of today in and out of Korea. To respond to this changing environment, we need to build a new order, which is never easy for anyone. The second term of Trump and the changing global order should be responded wisely, and also the democracy, which is in the danger on the front across the globe, should be tackled as well. The theme of today's event is the trajectory of Trumpism and Korea's choices. And early today, the U.S.-Korea summit was held, which added more meanings to this event. I think the choice of the theme was timely. As you know, the U.S. announced the America First policy without exception to the long-standing allies, putting pressure and demand on them. From our perspective, economy and security aspect of the diplomacy are both pressurized. The recent Korea-US summit was held under the huge tension, but across the talk, the two sides kind of built the consensus agreement to some degree, which is quite meaningful, I believe. And how to flesh out the discussion taking today would be the future task for all of us. And also, we need to build a peaceful Korean Peninsula, and we saw kind of a glimpse of hope in the recent talk. We need to boost Rock-US alliance while sharing the burdens in a reasonable manner to create a win-win outcome to the both parties. So we need to kind of produce that kind of solution continuously. The rise of extremists and the polarized the politics are flagging both nations, and Korea was not an exception. Fortunately, Korea was able to restore the nation's order, and we were able to recover the democracy jeopardized. However, we are still facing structural issues here and there. Extremists and the ideas and thoughts are here and there as well. Like the polarization, our citizens are being endangered, and democracy could not be able to use it as a tool to resolve this kind of issues. And I think that is one of the fundamental reasons for the crisis we're facing. Democracy needs to go beyond the textbook like a democracy so that we can contribute something to the society and lives of the people. By doing so, democracy could be a tool that bolsters the kind of solidarity of the community. Seeing the change of the international order and the trade order, we also need to figure out how to strengthen our competitiveness of our industries. So that's why we need to come up with the policies that can enhance the democracy of our society while helping the lives of the citizens. And we will do our best to make them possible. And I hope that the audience today will share their thoughts and ideas to find such solutions with some practical tips. And all the discussion today will be taken seriously by all the people, even by those who are not attending today's year by the National Assembly. We will take it seriously and do our best. Thank you so much. Mr. Woo Won-sik, the Speaker of the National Assembly, yet again attended the Munhwa Future Report, followed by the previous year. That concludes the opening ceremony, and we will begin the lecture and discussion. We will have some time to arrange the stage, and as soon as we're finished, we will begin the panel discussion.
Make America Great Again was a signature slogan of President Trump and a symbol that resonated far beyond the United States. The world now watches closely how Trumpism will evolve and what impact it may have on the international order. The security environment on the Korean Peninsula is more sensitive than ever, in particular. Not only the North Korean issue, but also U.S.-China strategic rivalry, as well as conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, present overlapping crises. This session will examine in depth the security challenges Korea faces amid these shifting dynamics and the strategic opportunities we must not overlook and miss. It will be a timely and highly relevant discussion for all of us. The second session will focus on global democracy under pressure, the influence of extremist movements. Many of you may have already observed the rapid spread of extremism and populism across the globe. This trend is visible not only in the US and Europe, but also across Asia. As conflict intensifies and societies grow polarized, concerns are mounting over the very stability of democracy itself, and the session will explore the essence of the crisis confronting global democracy and consider what political and social choices Korea must make in the years ahead. I believe that we are ready and proceed to the first session. The first lecture will be delivered by Dr. Kenneth Weinstein, one of the foremost U.S. experts on East Asia security, currently serving as a distinguished fellow at the Hudson Institute. He was president and CEO of the Institute from 2005 to 2020, greatly expanding its global influence and reach. He is a world-renowned scholar whose work spans global security, media, and trade policy. Today, he will speak on the theme Intensifying U.S.-China Strategic Competition, Assessing the Limits and Implications. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Weinstein with a big round of applause.
Distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends at the Munhwa Ilbo Future Forum. I'm honored to be here for the 8th annual Munhwa Ilbo Report, especially as the forum falls right after the historic U.S.-South Korea summit at the White House yesterday. Now, my focus today is going to be on the relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China, more than on the rather than on the U.S. ROK relationship or the PRC ROK relationship. But let me simply note that the U.S.-China relationship is the most consequential geopolitical dynamic of our time. The impact of what happens between Washington and Beijing shapes the future of security, global diplomacy, economic development, technological innovation, and prosperity for us all. And so today in my remarks, I'm going to examine where we have been, where we are now, and the uncertain path forward. So let me first begin with the great transformation from engagement to strategic competition. For 5 decades, U.S. strategy towards China was relatively consistent, and I'm painting with a very broad brush. Since Richard Nixon's historic visit to Beijing in 1972, America supported China's economic rise and its integration into the global trading system. The assumption, followed by other Western nations, was simple. Prosperity would lead to political liberalization in China. Now that era has come to an end. Xi Jinping's ascension to power marked a fundamental inflection point. Under his leadership, China became explicit about 2 strategic shifts that directly undermined the rationale for the Western engagement strategy with China. Domestically, Xi reimposed Marxist dictatorship reversing decades of gradual political opening in places from Xinjiang to Hong Kong and beyond. And internationally, he spoke openly of hegemonic ambitions that challenged the principles underlying the global order itself. Now, the numbers here tell the story of US-China dominance in global affairs. China is the world's second largest economy at $19.4 trillion in GDP, while the United States still is ahead at $26.9 trillion in GDP in 2023. The gap is narrowing, and the United States and China have the two largest defense budgets in the world, but there too the gap is narrowing. On the defense budget side, of course, the numbers don't get at the heart of the story. A significant portion of Chinese defense spending is off budget due to civil-military fusion, and the fact that salaries in the PRC are significantly lower than those in the United States. The US, moreover, is engaged in three principal theaters: Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific, as well as increasingly on our southern border, whereas China's armed forces have a more narrow focus. Now, another factor that is critical to the change in attitude that has reshaped US-China relations is China's strategic weaponization of national power. And we have seen this. China has weaponized almost every aspect of national power for geostrategic gain. The Made in 2025 program wasn't simply about economic development for China. The Made in China 2025 program was a blueprint for technological dominance through intellectual property theft and state-subsidized competition of emerging technologies and global supply chains. China, moreover, as we saw, leveraged its excess production capacity through the Belt and Road Program initiative, creating economic dependencies across Eurasia. Meanwhile, the rapid growth in R&D spending in China, now rivaling the United States, demonstrates China's commitment to technological supremacy in AI, quantum, biotechnology, renewable energies, and advanced manufacturing. Now, part two of my talk is Trump and Biden respond to Xi Jinping. And I think here it's important to note that these are responses to Xi Jinping oftentimes, and I think in part from the video that was presented here, one has the sense as if the United States is the actor making the principal decisions. But I think in the US-China dynamic, the United States is responding to Xi Jinping and what he has done. Now, President Trump has fundamentally altered America's China policy. In the 2016 campaign, he was focused on trade imbalances and currency manipulation, but his vision evolved into something far more comprehensive. Trump recognized that China's economic prowess wasn't simply about trade. It was about how China could, as I mentioned earlier, weaponize almost every aspect of national power for geostrategic gain, including supply chains for the most critical future technologies. And so the United States, under President Trump, took a multifaceted and rather rapid decision to fundamentally change our policies in the Indo-Pacific. To begin with, from February 2017, the United States, and here are increasing pictures of growing Chinese military activities in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, and here is the question of strategic competition. The president adopted Shinzo Abe's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy in 2017 to challenge the One Belt and One Road policy. The quadrilateral security dialogue with Japan, India, and Australia, which had been dormant since 2017, was reinvigorated since 2007 was reinvigorated in 2017. Export controls were placed on sensitive technologies so they could not be shared with China. And most importantly, the 2017 National Security Strategy highlighted the return of great power competition and really focused in part on China. And all of these questions came to the fore in the COVID-19 crisis when China leveraged its supply chains in PPE and other areas, and growing suspicions spread in the United States. And I believe most of our intelligence agencies argue that COVID-19's origins were in the Wuhan lab and not at the Wuhan market. Now, President Biden, I should note, maintained much of Trump's policies despite many disagreements with President Trump in many critical areas, the tough economic policies towards China, but his administration reframed the relationship with China as simultaneously competitive, cooperative, and adversarial, which is both a recognition of the complexity of the U.S.-China relationship, but also a reflection of the hope that was not met that the U.S. and China might cooperate, in particular on the challenge of global warming. Now, one area where the Biden administration had enormous success was in expanding the free and open Indo-Pacific into a comprehensive multilateral strategy, building a lattice of partners and allies. The first event happening in September of 2021 was the announcement of the AUKUS nuclear submarine deal that is going to provide nuclear-powered submarines to Australia in cooperation with the United States to enhance power projection for Australia. We, of course, saw the 2018 expanded partnership with Japan, South Korea, and the U.S., the Spirit of Camp David, in August of 2023. We saw the strengthened Quad, which moved beyond military affairs to focus on supply chains and global health. And we saw the restored U.S.-Philippines alliance upon President Marcos's election. And so these partnerships, of course, responded to the challenges that back here of the growing Chinese military expansion, the systematic militarization of artificial islands in the South China Sea, and the growing pressure in the East China Sea. And now let's talk about the uncertainties, the third part of my talk, which is navigating Trump's second term. Here, of course, there remain policy uncertainties and strategic paradoxes. 7 months into President Trump's second term, his China strategy remains a work in progress and faces several critical challenges. I think the first paradox is the paradox of peace through strength and strategic ambiguity. And I think this paradox it hangs over U.S.-NATO relations as well, in the sense that Trump believes firmly that the United States wants its allies to engage in burden sharing to a degree that past presidents have asked for. And in the case of NATO, it's been every American president since Dwight Eisenhower have asked our European friends and allies to do more for NATO. And I think President Trump feels that he, through the Hague Summit and the commitment of the U.S.-NATO allies to spend 5% overall on defense by 2035, that led the president to strongly reaffirm Article 5 for NATO, which was really critical. And I think the same paradox we face now in the Taiwan relationship. Deterring China from attempting to reunify with Taiwan for Trump requires a certain kind of strategic ambiguity, because if the United States makes the kind of firm declarations that President Biden did on 4 occasions, that indicating that we would firmly defend Taiwan, we were required to defend Taiwan in the case of an attack, that could convince the Taiwanese that they could rely completely on American protection. And instead, the president wants the Taiwanese to step up significantly for their own defense. And so it's led to this sort of strategic paradox. He believes in peace through strength, but to get parity out of our allies need to step up themselves, and then I believe we will get to that point of peace through strength, which we now see with regard to NATO. Now, within the Trump administration itself, of course, there are divisions between the primacists, call them hawks here, people who believe that U.S. global leadership is essential to global peace and prosperity. These are in much smaller numbers than in the first Trump term. These are people like former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. The prioritizers, these are people like Undersecretary of Defense Rich Colby, who believe we need to focus almost exclusively on the China threat to exclusion of other defense matters. And lastly, the restrainers, who believe that America is already overextended and needs to do more to focus at home. Now, Trump is neither a prioritizer, a primacist, or a restrainer. He is, however, the person who decides on U.S. engagement. And I'd say the following. I think the president, because of this strategic paradox of wanting to get our partners and allies to do more, he tends to act like a restrainer at times in order to get allied engagement. But once he gets that engagement, he will act in times like a primacist, as we saw in the case of the attack on the Iranian nuclear program, or as we have seen in his recent talk of strong security guarantees for Ukraine. And so he acts neither like a prioritizer who thinks one simply has to focus on the China threat, nor a restrainer. He goes beyond either of those. And it's in part because Trump himself, he does not pretend to be a strategic thinker. And he is instead someone who operates very instinctively in these matters. Now, as we look at another key issue that we've seen in policy uncertainty, obviously, is the trade negotiations, and I'll focus here primarily on the negotiations with China. The president's attempt to use maximum leverage in his trade negotiations with China was partly neutralized by China's control over rare earth metals, as the president mentioned yesterday in the Oval Office with President Lee, which prevented the United States from going full bore with the kind of tariffs that he wanted to place on China. And while the president, he's tried to navigate this by selling aircraft parts, as he mentioned yesterday in the press conference, by giving China access to older generation NVIDIA graphic processing unit chips in an attempt to keep the trade relationship more stable. It's China itself that has long pursued a policy of decoupling, first from dependence on Western search engines, then on dependence on Western chip manufacturing, and which we even saw yesterday with the notion that China may not buy these NVIDIA chips. While at the same time, we in the West need to enhance our own supply chain resilience, including developing and refining our own rare earth metals. And I think these trends will continue, but it is China that began the decoupling in some sense, and we, on the other hand, need to move forward and to de-risk. Nonetheless, despite the challenges in the relationship, I think both powers appear committed to, for the moment at least, to try to manage tensions rather than escalating towards confrontation. And I think this in part seems to indicate a crucial recognition of the stakes involved. But the critical question remains, is China's apparent recognition of the dangers of escalation genuine, or is it another example of Xi Jinping's strategic deception? Now, I think the answer to this question will determine whether competition remains manageable or slides towards confrontation. Now, let me conclude here about the path forward. The U.S.-China relationship, thanks in large part to Xi Jinping, has been transformed from the engagement era. We are clearly in a period of strategic competition. one that both nations need to navigate to avoid catastrophe. Clearly, we in the West need to build strength through partnerships, the multilateral approach, which began in the Trump administration through the Quad, through the enhanced U.S.-Japan alliance, the outreach to India and the like, was deepened under President Biden and should continue under Trump 2.0, which is a recognition that no single nation alone can manage China's rise by itself. That being said, let me simply say that I think the summit yesterday and President Lee's remarks at CSIS reaffirmed the notion that this is a time of choosing for nations, and that given both the China security threat, one that involves all aspects of national power from military to supply chains and beyond, that it's critical that our allies work closely with us in these matters. Now, I would say in this relationship, in these turbulent times, we all need to work to make sure the relationship doesn't turn for the worse. Success requires what I think both sides currently lack, which is a sustainable framework for long-term coexistence between competing visions of global order, particularly a vision that Xi Jinping has, which is a zero-sum vision of where he sees the world going. And in this uncertainty, America and its allies like South Korea have no choice but to continue the kind of peace through strength policy that President Trump articulated during his campaign, hoping that China's recognition of the dangers of escalation proves genuine rather than merely tactical. Now, the stakes could not be higher, not just for the United States, not just for China, not just for Taiwan, but for all of us who have to live with the consequences of how this relationship evolves. And so on that note, allow me to thank you, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you once again for your insights and sharing them with us through a great presentation. 네, 너무나도 좋은 강연해 주.
Thank you once again, Mr. Keith Weinstein. That was from Kenneth Weinstein. Please give a big round of applause once again to our first keynote speaker. Next, we will hear the second lecture from Professor Derry Press of the Department of Politics at Dartmouth College. Professor Press is an opinion leader in the field of nuclear strategy with extensive knowledge of North Korea's nuclear programs. He has long studied U.S. foreign policies, nuclear deterrence strategies, and changes in the military balance in East Asia. He received his doctorate degree from MIT and founder of the Dartmouth Sandia Nuclear Boot Camp and the Davis Institute for Global Security, where he trained young policy professionals and lead international security research. The title of his presentation is The Evolving U.S. ROC Alliance and Policy Response to North Korea. Please welcome with a big round of applause.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to address this forum. I'm grateful to the organizers for bringing experts together to discuss these critical issues. I've been asked today to speak about two connected topics: the topic of changes in the US-ROK alliance, and also the impact of growing North Korean nuclear capabilities. As we know, we are having this conversation today less than one day after the momentous and I think very successful summit between US and ROK leaders. There will be other opportunities to discuss the details of that summit, what precisely was agreed to, and what topics were put off for now until the next meeting. But what I'd like to do is take a step away from the headlines and the details of what was said in Washington yesterday and focus on the critical long-term challenges, the long-term tensions that may need to be addressed for the alliance to continue to thrive. Let me be clear before I go on that I'm speaking as a private individual, and therefore the opinions are merely my own. Okay. Let me start by saying that, in my opinion, the US-South Korean alliance is one of the most successful alliances in contemporary history. Together, we have deterred major North Korean attacks since 1950. Over and over throughout the decades, South Korea has proven itself to be a terrific partner for the United States. South Korea provides the majority of the military capabilities required to defend the Korean Peninsula, and South Korea has repeatedly supported the United States in conflicts all around the world. The United States has also been a good partner to South Korea, providing important additional military capabilities that contribute to South Korea's defense, and also providing the nuclear deterrence that shields South Korea from nuclear attacks. The alliance is valuable to both parties. However, the alliance may be entering a period of strain, partly as a result of domestic politics, but I want to focus on deeper tensions in the alliance. Deeper tensions that may leave both parties in the coming decade increasingly dissatisfied with what the alliance is giving it. In short, both countries will likely grow to want more from their partnership than they are getting, and both countries are hesitant to provide what it appears its ally deeply needs. In this talk, I will outline what I see as the two longer-term trends, the two longer-term tensions in the alliance, and I'll suggest one potential compromise. I'll be honest, I think that this compromise is far down the path, and it is a little discordant with what we're talking about today in the wake of such a successful summit. But nevertheless, the alliance is too valuable to not focus on the tensions. Let me say one last thing, which is to say, the strains in the US-South Korean alliance are natural. Alliances go through tense periods when there are significant changes in the strategic environment. What history shows is that alliances that adapt to reflect the changes in the world are the ones that thrive. Okay, so what are the core problems that affect and challenge the South Korean alliance in the coming years? Problem number one, changes in the nuclear balance of power and the declining credibility in the US nuclear deterrent. The core of the problem comes from two related sources. Source number one, the steady growth in North Korean nuclear capabilities. And source number two, North Korean steps toward delivery systems, nuclear delivery systems, that can reliably reach the United States homeland. Not only is North Korea increasing its nuclear stockpile and increasing the role of nuclear weapons in its military plans, but from the standpoint of deterrence, the more alarming, deeper trend is that once North Korea has the ability to reliably deliver nuclear weapons against the US homeland, fundamental assumptions about deterrence on the Korean Peninsula will need to be re-examined. North Korean planners will logically ask, would the United States really risk a half dozen US cities to protect its South Korean ally? South Korean friends may logically ask, would the United States be restrained in its defense of South Korea if US cities were at risk? Now, I'll tell you, when I talk about this problem with my American friends, many of them dismiss the problem, and they say these concerns are unimportant. They say, of course, the United States will defend South Korea. We have thousands of troops on the peninsula and decades of close political, social, and economic ties between our countries. But I'm concerned that that response misses the point. The question is not whether the United States would fight shoulder to shoulder with its South Korean allies if North Korea crossed the DMZ. Of course we would. The question is whether we would be significantly restrained in our support for South Korea, in our conduct of a war, if North Korea's nuclear threats jeopardized American cities. That's the problem. Analysts merely need to look at US caution in dealing with Russia over Ukraine to see these exact dynamics at work today. Okay. We've seen this problem before, and history provides some guides as to what we may expect. In the late 1950s, when the Soviets began building nuclear delivery systems capable of reaching the United States said, "Don't worry, Europe. We have deep political ties. We have strong economic links. We promise we will defend you." But the Europeans were not convinced. They were not willing to base their most important nuclear deterrence needs on US promises. And so they pressured the United States to do more to meaningfully enhance nuclear deterrence in Europe as a way of solving the extended deterrence problems that arose. Now, what were those steps, and how could they, in some future, apply to the Korean Peninsula? I'll come back to that in a moment. Let me just summarize for the moment. As North Korean nuclear capabilities grow, and specifically as they develop the capabilities to reach the United States, and on top of that, as the new US administration adopts a tougher and arguably less predictable approach to US allies, South Koreans may understandably ask themselves, can we base our nuclear deterrent completely on the promise of our US ally? So that's problem number one. How to maintain a credible extended deterrent once North Korea and its nuclear weapons can reach the United States. Problem number two. In the coming years, the United States will need more help from its allies. The rise of China, the growing US national debt, continued geopolitical challenges all around the world will strain US capabilities. The days of unipolarity are over. The United States will need greater capabilities from US allies. The United States will need greater coordination from US allies. And I'm afraid this is just a fact, regardless of who inhabits the White House. So the question is, how might this play out in different regions where the US has important alliances? In Europe, the United States and its allies have substantial strategic alignment on the most important issues that they care about. Yes, there are debates, always, between the United States and its NATO allies. There are debates about policy implementation. How exactly to bring about an end to the war between Russia and Ukraine? How exactly to put pressure on the combatants in the Middle East to end the terrible conflict there? There are disputes between the United States and its various European allies, always. But underneath those disputes, there is a largely shared definition of threat and a largely shared view about geopolitical objectives. And therefore, as a result, a broad willingness on the part of the European NATO allies to let the United States use forces and bases in Europe to promote shared objectives and interests in Europe, in North Africa, and in the Middle East. There is clearly tension in the US-NATO relationship, but it's largely focused on capabilities, not strategic alignment. It's whether or not the NATO allies will build enough forces that they can meaningfully contribute to shared missions. In Korea, arguably, the situation is reversed. On capabilities, South Korea is outstanding. South Korea is number one of all US allies in its willingness to provide forces for its own defense. The problem, the challenge, lies in what I would call imperfect strategic alignment between the United States and South Korea. Despite years of the countries shifting together, South Korea turning toward a more Indo-Pacific facing strategy, South Korea engaging in more trilateral cooperation with the United States and Japan, and now Australia. Despite that, there is still notable hesitancy on the part of South Korea to be drawn into military disputes that might involve China. I would say that South Korea's hesitancy is understandable. South Korea is here. China is nearby. But the gaps between the United States and South Korea in its definition of threat and in their strategic alignment will weaken the alliance over time. Okay, how do I explain this a little bit better? Let me kind of highlight this by pointing toward where these two tensions come together. If the growth in long-range North Korean nuclear delivery systems mean that the alliance will ask more of the United States, they will ask the United States to risk more, to put US cities on the line if there is a war on the Korean Peninsula, the United States might reasonably ask South Korea to play a deeper role in US military plans for the region than it has done in the past. That's the essence of problem two, a growing US need over time for allied support, and yet understandable South Korean hesitancy to pre-commit to full military cooperation with the United States. All right. The amount of pressure that these two tensions will put on the alliance will vary over time. Today, 12 hours after a very successful summit, I think the pressure is at its low point, and that is good. South Korea has a government which is preferencing and prioritizing reducing nuclear tensions on the Korean Peninsula, seeking to re-energize efforts toward denuclearization, and I understand those objectives, and I think they're motivated by a sincere motivation driving that policy. But if those efforts do not succeed because of North Korea's continued commitment to nuclear weapons and to expanding its arsenal's capabilities, then the effort toward denuclearization will leave us once again facing these two key problems: South Korea needing a more reliable deterrent, and the United States needing greater South Korean commitment. All right. What might a compromise look like? What might a path forward look like if these tensions begin to boil? When the Europeans confronted the same problem of extended deterrence 5 decades ago, 7 decades ago, they considered 3 options: the option of forward deployed US nuclear forces in Europe, the option of nuclear sharing between the United States and NATO, and the option of independent nuclear capabilities for the European members. And after considering all those 3 alternatives, they decided all of the above. The United States maintained nuclear forces on the continent, NATO created a nuclear sharing plan, and of course, France joined the United Kingdom as a member of the European Nuclear Club. Now, I have to admit, if I were South Korean, clearly my preference would be denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, if that could be accomplished. But if I concluded that that was not feasible, I could see a case for independent nuclear capabilities for South Korea. I could see South Korea making that argument. But I would also see that going in that direction would have real costs for South Korea. What are those costs? Withdrawing from the NPT would trigger some diplomatic costs. It would trigger some trade disruptions. It would involve building an arsenal that would be costly, and those costs would come at the expense either of South Korean taxes or some South Korean defense expenditures. But most of all, what I would be concerned about as a South Korean would be about timing. It would be about the window in between when South Korea withdrew from the NPT and when it acquired a nuclear deterrent. That window might create dangerous temptations to North Korea to attack, especially if the South Korean withdrawal triggered big problems in the US-South Korean relationship. So what I would suggest we think about is that if the current direction toward denuclearization doesn't succeed, that perhaps the option that we should be reconsidering is the option modeled on the European experience, the option of nuclear sharing. But here is a key point. Nuclear sharing is an alternative to an independent nuclear capability. It is also a stepping stone on that path if it doesn't solve the underlying problems. So the challenge is, if things develop in a direction that makes this a live conversation in the alliance, how do we come to agreement? How do we come to an agreement with the United States who doesn't like nuclear sharing, who is committed to nonproliferation, and who has based its foreign policy around a global policy of nonproliferation? One solution going forward is the possibility of linking better deterrence with closer strategic alignment, meaning the US meaningfully strengthens the nuclear relationship with South Korea broadens the military partnership with the United States. My South Korean friends have long asked me, for years, they've said, why does the United States treat South Korea differently than it treats Europe? Why is nuclear sharing okay in the context of US-NATO, but not in the context of the US-South Korean relationship? And I think that's a fair question. But I would also turn the question around, and I would say the US-NATO relationship is based not merely on the protection of Western Europe, but on a broader set of regional goals and a close geopolitical alignment on issues throughout the region vis-a-vis Russia and even extending to the Middle East. And so in the NATO case, deeper nuclear cooperation reflects broader geopolitical partnership. And that might be the key to both solving the immediate problems in the US-South Korean relationship and also using that solution to strengthen that relationship in the long term. Let me end by pointing out that there are two paths that we face. The first path is the one that revels in the optimism of the current summit, that chooses not to examine in a difficult way the tensions that are underpinning the relationship, and that doesn't seek to solve each other's allies' critical national security concerns. I can understand why that's politically appealing in the moment, but I would say that's the path to a slowly weakening relationship. That's a path to the United States degrading the importance of the Korean relationship in US national security policy. And I'm afraid that that's the path which in the long term will lead South Korea to go an independent direction. The alternative path is for both allies to confront their hesitancy, to take steps when requested by its partner that are attuned to solving its partner's sincere and legitimate security concerns, and that both solves the short-term problem in the relationship, but also builds a stronger and a deeper alliance going forward. So with that, let me thank you, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You may now take a seat on stage. 네, 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. 감사합니다.
A big round of applause once again for the speaker. Thank you. Now we will proceed with the panel discussion. After this discussion, we will have a Q&A with the audience. If you have a question, please write it down on the memo paper provided as a souvenir and pass it to a staff member nearby. Now let us invite Dr. Weinstein, Professor Press, Dean Lee Jong-hoon, and President Kim Hyun-wook to join us for the panel discussion. They are making their way up to the stage.
The chair of the panel discussion, Lee Jong-hoon, Dean of the Graduate School of International Studies at Yonsei University, is a leading scholar in the field of North Korean human rights and international security. He has served as Human Rights Ambassador for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and First Ambassador for International Cooperation on North Korean Human Rights. He is currently the chair of Unification Future Planning Committee. Kim Hyun-wook, director of Sejong Institute, will be joining us as a panelist. He is an expert on the ROK-US Alliance and Northeast Asian military security and has served as political advisor to the various government agencies, including the Ministry of Unification. I think everyone is on the stage, and let us begin the panel discussion. I will give the microphone to Mr. Lee Jong-won, the moderator of the panel discussion. Please.
I think your presentations and the contents of your presentations will serve as a very good backdrop that we can reference to the in analyzing and interpreting the summit outcome, and as we look forward to where are we headed from here in terms of U.S.-China relations, U.S.-ROK relations, U.S.-DPRK relations. So I look very much forward to our discussions. You've already been amply introduced, so I'm not going to do that. I will just add that Dr. Kenneth Weinstein is also on top of the Hudson affiliation. He co-founded with the former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo the Indo-Pacific Forum. He is one of the premier Japan specialists. Actually, he was appointed to go to Japan as U.S. ambassador to Japan, but because I remember the Senate had some issues, political issues in terms of the Supreme Court justice appointment, so it didn't pan out, and that's a loss to the U.S.-Japan relations. Daryl, I might just add that Daryl is very famous in Korea for the article that he's written with his wife, Jennifer Lin, in Foreign Affairs in 2023, right? In 2023, regarding South Korea's nuclear options. And of course, right next to me is president of Sejong Institute, who is until last year was also the president of the Korea Association of Area Studies, and he advises the government, Foreign Ministry, Unification Ministry, the National Security Council, on many of the government agencies on foreign relations as well as security policy. So I will now first turn to President Kim Hyun-wook, and I will give you about 5 minutes to comment on the presentations of the two presenters, and then I will come back to talk in a broader, spontaneous sense about your coverage of the issues on China, on North Korea, on deterrence, but also on some of the points that were raised during the summit between President Trump and President Lee, and also some aspects of the CSIS statement. So I will now turn to you, President Kim.
Thank you, Professor Jung-Hoon Lee. Actually, the Professor Jung-Hoon Lee was my master's thesis advisor a long time ago, so I think I learned a lot, and I'm still learning a lot from Professor Lee. I listened to two excellent speeches, and I think there were several important points that I want to make. For Dr. Kenneth Weinstein, I want to raise 3 points. I think you mentioned that first-term Trump government was focusing on the ideological and regime competition between U.S. and China, especially when there came out COVID and President Trump's raise of all these issues antagonized China. It brought up a lot of anti-China sentiment within the United States, and especially within Congress. I think this was succeeded by Biden government in forming a Democratic coalition, I think. But surprisingly, all these ideological agenda that President Trump raised in the first term just disappeared in the second term. So I'm just wondering why. This was a very good agenda for Trump to raise to deal with China. So that's first question I have for you. Second question, many experts in the world, including the experts in the United States, are pretty much disappointed with tariff agreement between U.S. and China. You know, President Trump raised a lot of tariff issues, raised the ratio of tariffs vis-a-vis China in the first hand, but I don't know what has been the outcome and process, but a lot of business firms, you know, talked to the President Trump and Trump government, and suddenly all the ratios of tariff against China has been, you know, dropped down. So maybe, yeah, rare earth is a big weapons for China to deal with Trump government. Well, I'm just wondering if there's any ideas or plans for Trump government to deal with China in the near future, to bash China more effectively. Third question, there is a prediction that in the year 2030, 40% of global manufacturing will be done by China. So yeah, from first term Trump, Biden government, and second term Trump, there are a lot of policies going on to pressure China. For example, export control, global supply chains, and tariff issues, and all that kind of things. But I think the core of the policy should be focused on, you know, reviving the U.S. High-tech manufacturing. So on that agenda, does President Trump has any ideas, you think? That's my question for you. And for Professor Darrell Press, you mentioned and compared the Soviet Union case to North Korea case. Because some countries, European countries during the Cold War period, was kind of fearing that would the U.S. Protect Paris, victimizing New York, things like that. So if that is kind of comparison you made to North Korea, but I think there's some differences between Soviet Union and North Korea. There is a differences in nuclear arsenals, capabilities, quantities, and also ICBM capabilities. So I think U.S. nuclear capabilities and ICBM capabilities will dominate North Korean nuclear capabilities. Rather, I think the thing that we are worrying about is if there comes any nuclear disputes or conflicts within the Korean Peninsula, would the U.S. really be willing to retaliate with nuclear weapons? Or would U.S. just want no conflicts in the Korean Peninsula, just calm down any possibility of conflicts within the Korean Peninsula, which means that if North Korea, uses nuclear weapons to assault South Korean territory or somewhere within or outside territory, would the U.S. really be willing to retaliate, with or without nuclear weapons? Or is the U.S. just focusing on China issues and Taiwan issues rather than North Korea issues? That's, I think, something that we have to consider. Second question I have for you. Why is there no forward deployment of U.S. nukes in Asia? A lot of Japanese experts were worrying when Putin mentioned the possibility of nuclear weapons in the war in Ukraine. But still NATO has full capabilities of conventional weapons and a huge amount of nuclear arsenals in European territory, but there's none in Indo-Pacific region. There's no massive conventional weapons of the United States and no nuclear weapons by the United States. So that's, I think, what Japanese experts were worrying about and South Korean experts were worrying about. If China uses nuclear weapons in the Taiwan Strait area, that will definitely have a huge impact on countries within the region. So I'm just wondering, comparing Europe and Indo-Pacific region, why U.S. is not forward deploying its nuclear weapons in Indo-Pacific region? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kim. So, number of questions raised to both panelists. So what I'll do is I'll give an opportunity for Ken and Daryl to respond to the questions briefly. And as you're responding, can you just add on your sort of like general take on the U.S.-ROC summit that just took about earlier this morning?
Well, thank you. First let me say on the summit, I think it really was, as Daryl noted, a success any way you look at it. Obviously the president had tweeted earlier in the morning about the churches that were being raids on churches, talked about raids on U.S. military facilities and the like, and there were some concern, obviously, going into the summit that this might be more challenging than it turned out to be. I thought that President Lee's demeanor in the White House was to the president's liking. They clearly got along, and I would say I think really the big issue that helped all along was the notion of making American shipbuilding great again. I think whoever came up with that idea deserves the Korean equivalent of the Nobel Prize. That really went a long way to meeting one of President Trump's great requests. Obviously, here in Korea, between HD Hyundai and Munhwa, you have some of the greatest shipbuilding companies in the world. And so, and I think there were so many pitfalls that could have emerged. Let me note on the North Korea question, for all the focus on the president's desire to meet with Kim Jong-un, when he was concretely asked about a visit, he immediately changed topics to a meeting with Kim Jong-un. He immediately talked about an invitation he has to come to Beijing. And so I wouldn't read too much into the North Korean focus of the president's talks. I view that as aspirational by the president, that he would like to bring peace to the peninsula, but it takes two to tangle. Let me answer Dr. Kim's excellent questions. The first on the ideological character of the competition with China. It's very interesting. That was a big focus of the first term between Vice President Pence's speech at Hudson Institute, an event which I actually chaired, which in 2018, which really marked the fundamental shift of U.S. policy on China, and also former Secretary of State Pompeo's series of major speeches in which he argued that the Chinese Communist Party highlighted the threat the Chinese Communist Party posed both internally and externally. Neither of those gentlemen are in the current Trump administration. The president doesn't think in ideological terms. He is not a student of public policy. He's someone who experiences in real estate, in reality television, his view is that the policy experts, that we don't have a broad enough vision that we're not creative enough to really deal with the challenges out there. And so this is the direction that he wants to go in. He's certainly picked up many of the themes that came out of the special committee on China on Capitol Hill. Not all of them, of course, as we're looking at the sale of TikTok that hasn't gone through just yet. But I think we'll see the president implement over time. Certainly the team he's put in place at Commerce, at DOD, and elsewhere are dead serious about the China challenge and are working over time. And this is, I think, an opposite approach to Xi Jinping. The famous Deng Xiaoping statement about biding your time. Xi Jinping sort of decided to put, pedal to the metal and start talking about his aspirations. I think the United States is going to bide our time moving forward as we build up our industrial capacities, which I'll turn to in a second, as we build up our rare earth manufacturing capacities, where we now have a serious industrial policy in place. And so even if on the short term we're not able to have we've had certainly wins in our trade negotiations with China, and we have yet to see the full outcomes of those negotiations, but the rare earth piece has sort of prevented the full victory that the president would have wanted. I think over time it will cause us to redouble our efforts on rare earths and the like. On advanced manufacturing, let me turn here and let me just wrap up. Look, one of the key pieces of the puzzle for the president was creating this thing called the Energy Dominance Council, which Secretary Interior Doug Burgum is chairing. And in part, the president has become obsessed about meeting the AI challenge with China. Key to meeting the AI challenge, the data center challenge, is developing next generation energy capacities. In particular, the president's focused for the first time on next generation nuclear. But he's also focused on LNG and the famous Alaska pipeline, which he talked about yesterday in the summit. And so we are trying to get our energy capacities in place so that we can be the dominant AI power. That's part of this gateway project that the president has undertaken with SoftBank, Oracle, and with, drawing a blank on the AI company that's involved. So it's OpenAI, and so I think all of these things will fit into an attempt to use AI to allow the United States to have the most advanced manufacturing capabilities, that we will be able to take the kind of manufacturing that you're able to do here with Hanwha, with HD Hyundai, bring it to the United States through AI, having it powered, and allowing us to step back into the manufacturing space. It will not be with the same number of jobs that manufacturing takes, but all these things will be automated over time, and I think that's the president's vision. It's something that led him to create this Energy Dominance Council.
Okay, thank you, Ken. Daryl?
Thank you, and thank you, President Kim, for terrific comments and really thoughtful questions. Let me address the two questions briefly and then say a word about the summit yesterday. President Kim pointed out that, of course, the comparison between the threat posed by North Korea today and the threat posed by the Soviet Union in the Cold War were different in many ways, and clearly he is correct. President Kim also very nicely restated the kernel of the problem that we nevertheless face. And the problem could be thought of in one way as saying there are questions as to whether the United States would retaliate after North Korea uses nuclear weapons. But to me, the problem is broader than that. There are questions about whether the United States would be restrained in its response, restrained in its support for South Korea in a war, restrained in its type of retaliation, restrained in its seeking for ceasefires and de-escalation, perhaps at odds with its South Korean allies, especially in a future, not the present, but a future in which North Korea has the reliable ability to strike the US homeland. Now, I want to be very clear, I am not being critical of the United States in saying this. The problem is not that there is something wrong with the United States or that we are a poor ally. I don't believe that's the case. The problem is inherent in the logic of extended deterrence, and it has always been that same problem. And that's why it is illustrative how the Europeans, our other very close allies, when confronted by a similar situation, said that they like us, they trust us, they have close relations with us, and yet they needed something more than assurances. And so it's my prediction, though I certainly do not intend to tell South Koreans how to manage their affairs, it's my prediction that if North Korea continues on its current course, that eventually South Korea will have to ask very difficult questions of the United States and request that the United States does much more for South Korea than we're currently doing. On the second question, the question of, well, if this is true, why are there not forward deployed US nuclear forces in Korea or East Asia today? I think the answer is there were in the past. And of course, the US nuclear forces that had been deployed on the Korean Peninsula were withdrawn at the end of the Cold War because circumstances had changed and they were no longer needed. That was a moment in time where the United States and South Korea were confident that together they could use conventional forces to defend against any conventional threat posed by the North, and I think that was wise. But that was also before North Korea developed its own nuclear weapons. And so in that context, I understand why that made sense. But the world's changed. And it's not just any old country with nuclear weapons, it's North Korea, who habitually violates international norms, who habitually violates international law, and who frequently makes threats about nuclear weapons. So what I would say is I understand the decision at the end of the Cold War to withdraw them, but it's always incumbent, it's a task upon us to constantly ask whether the strategic circumstances have changed in a way that requires that we reevaluate the decisions that we made together.
Well, Daryl, on that last point, as Dr. Kim also pointed out, I think you remember that in the early part of the 1990s with the collapse of the communist bloc, Soviet Union, that sort of a inter-Korean relations shifted as well. And North and South Korea, of course, made a promise to denuclearize. Unfortunately, after, some 35 years, we've kept the promise. Our end of the bargain, North Korea has not. And here we are. So circumstances have changed, and therefore, I think it does beg the question of what are we going to do about North Korea having reneged on its promise? And as you rightly point out, who knows, maybe 50 nuclear warheads North Korea has today. Maybe extended deterrence is sufficient for that. But what if in 5-10 years, North Korea possesses 200, 250 nuclear warheads? This brings back your point about is extended deterrence sufficient, especially when you have your president changed every 4 years with different political ideas and whims. It's very destabilizing and discomforting as far as we're concerned. Can I come back to the summit meeting? So my expectation was that I was hoping to find out a little more in details about the tariff rates, about maybe the burden sharing, and then there were a lot of other sort of issues, including strategic flexibility, but none of these sort of key issues that we were expecting were dealt with. I think you're absolutely right that the atmosphere was very nice. A lot of flattery going back and forth, which is great, but my biggest concern before the summit actually took place was, what if President Trump really presses President Lee on the China issue? Okay, where do you stand? And how he will respond to that? Well, that question was actually never really raised. But very interestingly, in the CSIS conference where President Lee spoke, President Lee alluded to, I think Dr. Hamry raised this question about, there's this impression that you are maybe overly pro-China. Okay, what do you say to that? And his response was that, well, when the United States wasn't so stringently containing China, that it was possible for South Korea to lean towards the United States for security and lean towards China for economic cooperation. But that's no longer tenable because the world has changed and the United States is now trying to contain China and its cohorts, and that the world has turned into a liberal, democratic sort of like supply chain order versus China and other followers. In this new situation, it's no longer tenable to continue this like security US, economy China. That's an extraordinarily significant statement. He is, despite him having been labeled as sort of like China sympathizer or pro-China, that he's making a quite dramatic statement that the most important thing is the alliance with the United States. Can we expect this to continue in the next couple of years in terms of a very strong alliance-led Lee Jae-myung government's foreign policy? What would be China's response to that? Maybe all three of you can respond to that. What will China say?
Well, look, first of all, I think it was a model statement of clarity, and particularly because it came up in the Q&A, and I think it was stated in a way that I think was very helpful, not just here in South Korea, not just in Japan, but in the broader Indo-Pacific as well, where we have nations that sort of tilt between that rely on the United States for security, but rely on China for economic growth. And I think it was a model statement of clarity and something that I think was really, it will be an off-stated phrase going forward by those of us who work on Indo-Pacific policy. Look, I think China will continue to leverage all aspects of national power to try and undermine this sentiment here in South Korea, whether it be through those in the president's own party who are more favorable to China, who are more skeptical of the United States, and certainly China will use both its economic power, its public diplomacy power, and the like to put pressure on both Korean business and Korean officials to the extent possible, and elected officials to try and undermine what the president said. And it'll certainly be a challenge moving forward for the president to hew very strongly to that position, given both the economic interests and some of the ideological criticisms of the U.S. and policy criticisms of the U.S. But I think it would bode well for the future of the alliance, for the U.S.-Korea alliance, if the president would hew to that line.
Dr. Kim?
Yeah, I think, what I recently talked much about is the strategic value of China to South Korea. 1990s and 2000s, when China's economy rose quickly, China provided a lot of, important economic opportunity to South Korea. There was cheap labor, Chinese cheap labor, and South Korea could export a lot of commodity to China. A lot of market sharing in Chinese market was guaranteed to South Korean business firms. But that's all gone. China's economic structure has changed. It's now competing with South Korea. China doesn't give any more a market sharing for, South Korean business firms, commodities, and the labor is not cheap anymore. All the, factories in South Korean factories in China is now, moving out of China because of all the, high labor, costs. and it's batteries and AIs and electric cars and semiconductors. They're all competing with South Korea. So if China dominates over U.S. in its competition with China and competition between U.S. and China, that's not good for South Korea. I mean, China is overriding the U.S. as time goes by. Let's assume that. But that is not beneficial to South Korea because there is more and more competition between South Korean business firms and Chinese business firms. What we have to be careful about is that Chinese raw materials that South Korean business firms, manufacturing, semiconductors and pharmaceuticals and batteries, we all depend upon, Chinese raw materials, which is the same to the United States. The U.S. is depending upon, Chinese, rare earth materials. So I think that's something we have to, cooperate. I mean, in the summit meeting what happened yesterday, there was a mineral related, agreement between South Korea and the United States, which is very important. The strategic, minerals and strategic materials are really key issues that we have to cooperate vis-a-vis China in the near future.
Okay, Daryl, I mean, you can make a point about China too, but I do want to throw another aspect of the summit. It seemed that during the summit, Kim Jong-un and North Korea, I mean, it seemed to be like 70-80% of the talk between President Lee and President Trump focused on Kim Jong-un. And I lost count, but President Trump, he's referencing to Kim Jong-un, saying how he gets along great with Kim Jong. I lost count at 5. I think there were probably more. And constantly saying that he's willing to meet him, maybe during the APEC when it comes to Korea. That President Lee is also, I mean, I think he mentioned that you're the peacemaker, I'll be the pacemaker. So this was really a big thing. So do you see a meeting with Kim Jong-un? How likely is that? Because if you recall from the Hanoi meeting, it faltered because North Korea was not prepared for the denuclearization that the United States was expecting. I mean, there wasn't much denuclearization issue talked about during the summit, and yet they keep talking about wanting to meet Kim Jong-un. So are we giving up on denuclearizing North Korea, or do you feel that which comes first? Is a summit meeting with Kim Jong-un possible without Kim Jong-un compromising on his nuclear program?
That's a great question. I cannot predict whether there will be a summit with Kim Jong-un, but I can talk about this issue of denuclearization. And I will preface that by saying what I said in my remarks was quite sincere, which is a renewed effort in South Korea to pursue the goal of denuclearization. I understand the motivation behind that. Nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence are dangerous, and a future, if it could be achieved, of no nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula, I think would be beneficial to both the United States and South Korea, so I understand that. I will say I think that there are profound reasons to be skeptical that denuclearization can be achieved. And the core of it is this, which is you often hear North Korea experts debate among themselves about why it is North Korea wants nuclear weapons. Some people say it's for status, and some people say it's for leverage, and some people say there's many different reasons. But the way I think about it is those are all possible reasons layered on to the essential reason. And the essential reason is that nuclear weapons are an insurance policy for North Korea. It's an insurance policy which Saddam Hussein did not have. It's an insurance policy which Muammar Gaddafi did not have. And it's an insurance policy which Ukraine did not have. And I think that when North Korean planners and strategists look at the world, they see a world of tremendous uncertainty. Now, we might see it and see that the uncertainty is largely of their creation, and I believe that, but they nevertheless see a world in which their nuclear arsenal stands between them and those who they fear. And that includes the United States, and that includes South Korea, and it may include Beijing. And so when I look at this and I ask, is denuclearization a worthy long-term goal? I'd say yes. When I ask, should that be the foundation of an approach to the deterrence problem on the Korean Peninsula, my immediate answer is to say that's a question for South Koreans to answer. But as an American friend of South Korea and as a supporter of the US-Korean alliance, I wouldn't put too much stock resting on the hope of denuclearization.
So if that's the case, then of course we have to focus on deterrence, as you rightly pointed out. And you, of course, mentioned the nuclear sharing as an alternative. What about the alternative of the renegotiation of the nuclear agreement that the United States and South Korea have? We've signed that 10 years ago. Of course, I'm talking about reprocessing and enrichment. Before President Trump became the president, there were some mumbles, some people in South Korea were thinking that with Trump, maybe not Biden, but with Trump, it will be possible to renegotiate and have that option, nuclear option, by reprocessing and enriching. Japan does it, so why not us? Do you think that that's a possibility?
In some sense, those are two different approaches to the same objective. Meaning, I describe nuclear sharing as an imperfect solution to the extended deterrence problem. Nuclear sharing is itself imperfect because at the end of the day, it still leaves the United States as the decider because there are US nuclear weapons on the peninsula. And if there's a fundamental credibility problem, there's still a fundamental credibility problem. The advantage of nuclear sharing is that it partly solves that problem while also being a stepping stone to later steps that South Korea may feel reluctantly obliged to take if things worsen. And the alternative you suggested is another route to the same objective. There are a variety of reasons that we could dive deeper in why I would prefer a nuclear sharing approach, but those are two different approaches designed to reduce the time period if South Korea decided to take that step, and also try to convince regional actors, both North Korea, China, and Russia, to use their influence on the situation to try to restrain the North Korean actions that are creating this problem in the first place.
Okay, thank you, Daryl. We are fast running out of time, so I'll be quick with my questions, and maybe a terse answer will be good. Another very interesting development out of the summit I noticed was how President Trump was so direct in talking about Korea-Japan relations. And Ken, you're an expert on Japan, and I was actually surprised how President Trump specifically talked about the comfort women issues, and that I think he said that, hey, wasn't this issue settled many times over the past several decades? Why is it still an issue? This is Trump saying, I'm having a hard time bringing you guys together. What do you say to that? And President Lee's response was that that's why I went to Japan first. That he understands how President Trump values good relations between Japan and South Korea. and that this issue was discussed, and that he's settled it. This is President Lee saying that. Have we seen the end of issues like the past issues like comfort women and forced labor issues in Korea-Japan relations in the context of U.S., Korea, Japan trilateral relations? Ken?
Another excellent question. Look, President Trump, in his first term, had his national security advisor meet regularly with their South Korean and Japanese counterparts because he himself, behind closed doors, would talk about the U.S., Japan, South Korea trilateral alliance, which he believed should be a trilateral alliance. We're now getting closer to that vision, certainly, and President Yoon deserves enormous credit there. Look, the president, on issues of the past, he doesn't want to dwell on them. He wants to focus instead on the current security challenges, which are very deep, and in his mind, those should bring Japan and South Korea together. And I think it's a very positive step that President Lee went to Tokyo, had a very successful visit with Prime Minister Ishiba, and that he was able to bring that to Washington. So I think all of those things bode well for Japan-Korea relations and for meeting the China challenge.
Okay, so this is all questions from the audience. I'm afraid we don't have time for all that, but I do want to, before getting to this, I do want to raise one more very interesting point that President Trump raised in making reference to U.S. base or bases in South Korea. Just out of the blues, he's talking about how he wants to change from leasing the land of these bases to owning this land. Where is this coming from? Have you heard this before, Dr. Kim?
I don't know. Maybe this is one of the series of Trump government. President Trump's thinking he want to have Greenland to be owned by the United States, wants Canada to be another state of the United States. I think he wants to own, some of the foreign lands. I think that's the idea. I think came out of President Trump, but it's based upon SOFA that the owner should be South Korean government, and the U.S. military is renting the bases for the use of the U.S. forces of Korea. So I think if Trump really wants to own the land, I think South Korea, U.S. has to talk about how to revise SOFA. But I think that's in reality not easy job, I think.
Would you like to make any comments on that?
Well, let me note his background is in real estate. And when we had the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, President Trump was in particular critical that President Biden gave up the Bagram Air Base, given its strategic proximity to China and also to Iran. So he thinks in those kind of real estate terms when it comes to issues like this in part.
Okay. There are too many questions, but I see some commonalities in many of the questions, and I think it has to do with the strategic ambiguity. Yeah, so I'll just read off the very first one. It's from Bona. Can strategic ambiguity in Taiwan cross-strait relations be regarded as the guiding principle of U.S. policy? I guess probably more appropriate question is what will South Korea do if there is a contingency? In yesterday's Munhwa Ilbo press, President Lee made it pretty clear that he's against strategic flexibility of the U.S. forces in Korea. But when push comes to shove, can that stance be maintained? What's your opinion on this contingency on the cross-straits and the role of the U.S. forces in Korea and possibly Korean forces?
Can I just jump in? When I was talking about strategic ambiguity, that's not a guiding principle. That's a tactic that President Trump's using to get the Taiwanese to step up, as he got the NATO forces to step up by doing the minimum for Ukraine to make them understand it's their problem, and the Taiwanese need to understand that. So, but yeah, do you want to say or? On the strategic
yeah, strategic flexibility as it affects the Taiwan Straits, right? I think in a sense this cuts to the core of the issue. And again, I think it's important for us as allies to understand the reasonableness of the two positions. They are in tension, and they are also reasonable. If I were a South Korean citizen, I would hate the idea of South Korea being drawn into a shooting war in which the United States was operating fighter aircraft from South Korean bases for the purpose of defending Taiwan in a conflict with China. I would hate that idea. On the other hand, as an American, I will say this. A different analyst, somebody who was here in Korea recently, a friend of many of the people in this room, said that if there was, God forbid, a shooting war between the United States and China over Taiwan, and South Korea did stand on the sidelines and didn't allow US forces to operate from the Korean Peninsula, and the war went badly for the United States, that would be the end of the US-South Korean alliance. And this was said by somebody who is deeply committed to the alliance, and I think he might be right. So I would say the key here is to understand both views. There is a good reason for South Korea to be hesitant, but South Korea also should understand the risks that the United States is running, not merely in coordination with South Korea here on the Korean Peninsula, but largely in support of joint objectives in East Asia. I would say not to contain China, really, but to try to manage the manner of China's rise so that it's not violent, so that it's not warlike, and so that it doesn't create the long-term militarized standoffs in East Asia that we've seen in other parts of the world. For that objective, US and South Korean interests are largely aligned, and therefore, if South Korea does not play not merely a political role in this effort, but a military role as our ally to try to prevent those catastrophic wars, then I think that would be a big problem for the United States.
Dr. Kim, do you want to, no? You're okay? Okay, I think our time's up, so I'd like to just say that, now that the much anticipated summit meeting is over, it's back to working out the details in US-ROC alliance relations. From setting the tariff rates clearly, to collaborating on shipbuilding, to opening or not opening the rice and meat market in South Korea, to denuclearizing North Korea at some point. I think both President Trump and President Lee have really their hands full to deal with these issues. With China and North Korea lurking behind, the alliance will surely be tested in the coming years. In this session, the first session, we explored some ways to overcome these challenges. Ken rightfully mentioned of some of the multilateralism, like the AUKUS, Quad, that South Korea can get involved to overcome these issues. And Daryl Press talked about the options in deterrence, which could enhance South Korea's security. To me, I think the key to South Korea's future is actually very simple. One, I identify three. One, strong economy. Two, strong military. And three, strong alliance. As simple as that. And I'm hoping that the new Lee Jae-myung government succeeds in achieving these three goals. And on that note, I'd like to thank the excellent panels that we had. Kim Hyun-wook, Dr. Kim Hyun-wook, Dr. Ken Weinstein, and Dr. Daryl Press. So please give a warm round of applause to the panelists for their presentations and the discussions.
Thank you to our moderator as well. 네, 감사합니다.
The great game in East Asia begins now.
Thank you very much for the intriguing panel discussion. You may now return to your seats. 네, 자리로 다시 모시겠습니다. 토론을 진행해 주신 네 분.
I would like to thank you once again, the four members of the panel, for their discussions. Please give them another round of applause. It has been a valuable opportunity to hear the insights of distinguished experts from various fields. This concludes the first session held under the theme Security Landscape in the MAGA Era. We've had very diverse discussions on this topic, and we will now take a short break, and session 2 will begin at 4:55 under the theme Global Democracy Under Pressure, the Influence of Extremist Movements. Please enjoy your break, and I hope that you will be seated by 4:50. We have coffee.
So I think everyone is here, so please be seated so that we can begin the next session.
휘둘리는
Yes, the second session will proceed under the theme of the global democracy under pressure, the influence of extremist movements. For the first presentation, we have with us today Professor of Political Science Francis Fukuyama at Stanford University. Professor Fukuyama is widely known as the author of The End of History and The Last Man. He is a leading global scholar in the fields of democracy and international politics. He has offered profound insights into modern politics and the nature of liberal democracy. Today, he will speak on the theme Trust and the Global Crisis of Democracy. Please welcome Professor Fukuyama with a big hand.
So thank you very much for the introduction. I'm really delighted to be at the Munhwa Future Forum report, or part of the process, and I look forward to speaking to you not about foreign policy, but about some of the internal dynamics of the United States, Korea, and other countries. So I wrote a book that was published in 1996 called Trust, because I think that trust is actually a critical component or aspect of a democracy that is necessary for the proper functioning of political institutions. In that book, I had a chapter on Korea and I had a chapter on the United States. And I characterized Korea as a low-trust society for reasons I could explain further. But at that time, I said that the United States was a high-trust society. I wouldn't say that today, 20 years later. Unfortunately, I think the level of trust in the United States has dropped very, very dramatically, with very dire consequences for American democracy. And in that respect, the United States and Korea are actually very similar in having both turned into rather low-trust societies in which there is an extreme degree of polarization, distrust of institutions, and a kind of revolt against the old order that had existed. And so that's what I want to explore. I'm going to begin with the global crisis of democracy. Professor Kramer is going to also talk on this subject in the talk that will follow mine, so I'm not going to spend that much time on that, but I do want to put into perspective the kind of broader political environment that we have been facing over the last few years. So there's been what's been called a democratic recession or democratic backsliding, rise of authoritarian great powers, and also the rise of populist nationalism in many democracies around the world. So let me go through this in turn. The global democratic recession. There is an NGO called Freedom House, of which I'm a board member, that publishes an annual report on freedom in the world. And its last report that was issued last spring said that there has been a global decline in democracy, in the aggregate amount of democracy in the world, now for the last 19 years. This is something that we can trace in figures. So the top line are electoral democracies, and the lower line are liberal democracies. As you can see, there was a big expansion in the number of democracies beginning in the 1970s, and it kind of peaked around the year 2008. But since that point, which was also the moment of the great financial crisis, democracy has been backsliding, and that backsliding has been manifest in a number of ways. If we look at a similar graph that's based on population, rather than simply counting countries with a population of over 1 million, there's an even more dramatic fall off. That drop in the line in 2022 approximately is really due to the backsliding that has occurred in India in recent years under Narendra Modi. Now, there are several components to this global trend. The first has to do with these two gentlemen and their respective countries, so that's Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. Unlike the world 20 years ago, we now have two strong, powerful, well-consolidated authoritarian states that I think are pretty explicitly authoritarian. Russia claims to have elections, but these are really fraudulent and don't really reflect democratic will. Of course, China doesn't even make that pretense. They're both powerful. Obviously, China is in a better competitive position. President Trump actually in the Alaska summit told Putin, we're number one and you're number two, which must have been a big surprise to Xi Jinping, given the fact that the Russian economy is smaller than Italy's economy. So why President Trump thinks they're number two is a little bit curious. But nonetheless, they've got a big military. They have nuclear weapons, and both of these countries pose strategic threats to Western or Western-oriented countries, the United States and its allies. And they have achieved a fair amount of stability over recent years. Now, there's another component to the democratic backsliding that really didn't have a counterpart during the Cold War, and that I think is really, in a way, more insidious, because you have democratic leaders that are illiberal, right? So a liberal democracy really has two components. There is the liberal part, which has to do with the rule of law, the willingness to observe constitutional limits on executive power, and there's the democratic part that has to do with free and fair multi-party elections. And so in a number of countries, in India under Narendra Modi, in Turkey under Tayyip Erdogan, in Hungary under Viktor Orban, and formerly in Brazil under Jair Bolsonaro, you had democratically elected leaders whose first act is really to attack the liberal part of liberal democracy. They're legitimately elected, at least at first, but they use that mandate to say the people elected me and I don't want to be constrained by judges, by the press, by opposition parties, by anyone that stands in the way of my ability to do what you elected me to do. And for that reason, the liberal part of liberal democracy has declined in all of these places. Now, there's also connections between these categories of people. So Russia and China are allies with each other. They are supporting each other's projects. China does not sell weapons directly to Russia, but they sell lots of equipment to their military industrial base. They are the largest consumer of Russian oil, and together with North Korea and Iran, have created a real axis of evil, so to speak, of the sort we thought we witnessed at the time of the 2003 Iraq invasion, but something that has become quite active here. In the case of these populist nationalists, there's one more that we can add to the list. Donald Trump, elected first in 2016 and then elected again last year, who follows that pattern set by Orban and Modi and Erdogan quite exactly. He's democratically elected. Nobody would contest the legitimacy of his election, but he has proceeded to attack liberal institutions. He does not like the kinds of constraints of constitutional precedent and law that should be acting there as limitations on presidential power. Since Donald Trump was inaugurated on January 20th, he has issued well over 100 executive orders. Instead of following the procedure set by the US Constitution to have Congress make the laws, he has unilaterally declared that, for example, birthright citizenship is no longer valid, despite the fact that that is clearly stated in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. He has fired very senior officials, despite laws saying very clearly that he does not have the authority to remove certain high-level officials like the head of the Federal Reserve. He has tried to purge the bureaucracy. He's used a very expansive sense of executive power, one that has really not had very many precedents in American history, basically to intimidate his opponents in universities, in law firms, in the corporate world. And in many respects, in the last panel, there was an attempt to, I think that the panelists explained that it was hard to find consistent structures in Trump's foreign policy. I think that part of the problem is that this is really the first personalistic president of the United States whose policies are very much shaped by his own sense of his own self-interest. And that means that it's a very different kind of world we're living in, where he's not shaped by ideology, he's not shaped, for example, by the principle of isolationism. He's basically shaped by what he perceives as his personal agenda. And one of the big differences between the first Trump term in 2016 and the current one is that his personal agenda has changed. He feels deeply aggrieved that he was prosecuted over the past 4 years, and he wants to get revenge. And so this is showing up in acts like what happened this past week, where he has the FBI search the house of John Bolton because the FBI searched his residence at Mar-a-Lago, and he wants to take personal revenge on every one of those critics. He encouraged the January 6th rioters to storm the Capitol to prevent his having to transfer power to Joe Biden. Those more than 1,000 of them were arrested and convicted. One of his first acts on January 6th was to pardon even those that had violently assaulted police officers, and now he's threatening to go after and arrest the prosecutors that he believes were tormenting him. So the agenda is really set, I think, by a much narrower sense of his own self-interest. But that is actually true of all of those other illiberal, democratically elected populist leaders that I mentioned. All right, that's it for the global backsliding. Now I want to talk about the question of trust, because there are a number of components to why trust has deteriorated. You can see this in a lot of statistical surveys like the General Social Survey that show that the level of trust in institutions has really deteriorated in many countries around the world. So this is just a list of some of the factors, and I will go through them one by one. So let's begin with the rise of populism. Political scientists have a number of definitions of populism. I have come to the belief that there's one central core issue for populists, which is the belief that institutions have been captured by elites, and that the institutions that are visible to everybody, like television, newspapers, magazines, Hollywood, all of these big things that structured our lives are actually not what they seem. They don't represent reality. They are actually being manipulated behind the scenes by shadowy forces that are using them for their own purposes. It means that you're no longer driven by institutional rules, but you're driven by personality. That picture is of one of the original populists, Eva Perón in Argentina, who, along with her husband, Juan Perón, really set the standard for this kind of personalistic politics in which your primary loyalty is not to a constitution, not to a political system, but to an individual leader. Donald Trump, before he was elected, said, "I alone understand your problems and I alone can fix them." That's not the Republican Party, it's not the American Constitution, it's me personally. And this has been true of many populist leaders since that time. One of the interesting things that has been mutating is the very definition of what it means to be a conservative. I would say in the United States certainly, but in many other countries as well, which really does have to do with conspiracy theories. So again, that flows naturally from the definition I just gave you of what it means to be of what it means to be a populist. This belief that reality is different from what you think it is, that it really is being manipulated behind the scenes. And so there is a very key part of the MAGA coalition standing behind Donald Trump that, for example, believes in this QAnon conspiracy theory that the Democrats are really a network of pedophiles that are abusing children in tunnels underneath Washington, D.C. Completely outlandish understandings of what reality really is, but to many of these people, it gets to the core of what they understand themselves to be, that they are truth seekers that alone are able to perceive, the reality around them. And it means that increasingly conservatism becomes unlinked with institutions, with the visible institutions of the society. And that's why, for example, Jeffrey Epstein, the pedophile procurer that hanged himself in prison after he was convicted of sex trafficking, continues to be an issue for these people. Many people in Trump's base, it turns out that Trump himself looks like he's implicated in that conspiracy. And so he's been, working overtime to try to distract attention away from anything related to Jeffrey Epstein. All right, second issue that I think lowers trust in our societies is the ossification of traditional political parties. So if you think about it, Korea is a younger democracy, but in Europe, in Japan, for example, where the LDP has been in power since 1955. In Europe, the major political parties, the British Labour Party or the German Social Democrats, have been around since the late 19th century. These are parties that have a very long track record and really have not come up with new ideas in a very long time. And one of the consequences of this is that a lot of populist voters are young people. They're young people who, unlike their parents' or their grandparents' generation, do not assume that the world has to be structured by these old existing political parties that they believe are corrupt and out of touch. And therefore, a lot of the vote shares for the challenger populist parties have come from people that are, under 25 years of age. And this is a very remarkable and clear pattern in voting where it is actually older people, people in my generation that continue to support some of those existing parties, but younger ones want something really different. Another issue that I have been particularly concerned with has to do with the failure of democracies to actually deliver real goods that their citizens want. And a lot of that is in the domain of infrastructure. So those two pictures, the picture on the left is a Three Gorges Dam that the Chinese built. They had to move about 1.3 million people out of the floodplain to get there in 10 years, and they did it. The other is Stuttgart 21, a high-speed rail station in the city of Stuttgart. It was started in the late 1980s, and it's still not been constructed. And I think that you'll see failures of this sort in the United States, in Britain, in many other democratic societies. If you think about what the Belt and Road Initiative is about, it is about building things, and that is a contest in many developing countries where the United States and other Western consortia have not been competitive. The Chinese can underbid and outperform their Western counterparts very easily, and that has given them a big leg up in the contest for political power. So another issue has to do with corruption. Now, whether there's actually objective levels of corruption is very hard to say. It's very hard to measure who is corrupt and who is not. But it is very clear that the charge of corruption has become a key political weapon in the battle between populist parties and mainstream parties. We see this in the United States, where corruption charges have become political tools. By the way, this is not just something on the right. So the gentleman in the picture is Alexandre Moraes. He's a Supreme Court justice in Brazil. Brazil has one of the most independent court systems in Latin America, and he's been very diligent in going after corruption charges, but also in a way that has invited charges of politicization, because most of his targets have been left-wing politicians. And for that reason, the Trump administration has actually barred him from getting a visa to come to the United States. Tulsi Gabbard, our Director of National Intelligence, has just recommended that the Justice Department lodge criminal charges against former President Obama and for what she claimed was criminal interference in the 2020 election. I thought the 2020 election was over, but apparently it's not. But again, this is the use of the criminal justice system for purposes, basically for political purposes. And so this again is a misuse of the justice system for as simply another weapon in politics. I would note that in your country, a lot of your previous presidents have faced corruption charges, and I think it's something that Koreans have to ask themselves whether this is really dealing with corruption or whether this has not simply become another weapon in an ongoing, highly polarized political struggle. We have a big problem in terms of the credibility of modern science today in a way that we did not 20 or 30 years ago. So there's declining trust in science. Part of that is driven by economic interests. You know, the oil companies funded studies showing that global warming was a big hoax. But it's also driven by some real things. I think people do not understand the degree to which the COVID epidemic has fueled populism in the United States, in Europe, in many other parts of the world, because the scientific community, the public health community claimed the mantle of science, but they were proven wrong in a number of areas. And this, I think, has really damaged the overall credibility of people that claim to be speaking in the name of science. The expert consensus is actually not always correct. Now, technology, I would say, is probably one of the biggest factors in decreasing public trust in institutions. Everybody is familiar now with the rise of the internet, with the rise of social media, the way that social media has been weaponized to be able to target very, very specific communities. It is in the economic interest of the big tech platforms to create virality, to create people that want to use their platforms, and the way they do it is through, sensationalist influencers that are able to attract big audiences, not because they say things that are true and credible, but simply because they say things that are salacious, scandalous, or simply very targeted politically. I think that the rise of artificial intelligence is going to add another big layer and is already beginning to affect the nature of trust in institutions. I don't know about you, but when I look at my Instagram feed these days, I would say that about half of the videos I see are deep fakes, and you really can't tell which ones are things that were actually said by a particular politician and which were faked. This also has sinister implications for surveillance and control. China is the leader in this. Both both Google and China have similar files of information on hundreds of millions of individuals. The only difference is that Google is a private company that we think probably wants to use this information only for money-making purposes. China wants to use it to control the lives of every single one of its 1.4 billion people, and it is able to exercise a degree of totalitarian control over them that is really unprecedented. So I think that another issue really has to do with gender. Gender was important in your presidential election, where a lot of young men ended up voting for one of the two more conservative candidates. This was definitely a factor in the American election, where a lot of young men, including a lot of young African American and Hispanic men, swung towards Trump in the later part of the election because they didn't think that Kamala Harris and the Democrats had much to offer them. A lot of their appeal was really focused on women and trying to get out a female vote based on the abortion issue, and that really left a lot of young men out in the cold. In my view, this has really been a reflection of a broad socioeconomic change as we move from industrial to post-industrial societies. In a post-industrial society, the average worker isn't lifting heavy objects off of a factory floor. They're sitting in front of a computer in a service economy, and in that kind of a role, women have a much more natural part to play. And this shift in economic power has had many ramifications in almost every society, here in the United States, in Europe, even in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, Iran. A majority of students in higher education institutions are women. And so even though there may be a lot of economic inequality that continues to favor men today, that shifts as we go further into this kind of information society in a relentless way year after year. And that has, for better or worse, made a lot of men, especially a lot of young men, insecure about their futures and their feeling that they are losing ground to women that seem to be favored by the society. All right? Now, not all of these issues apply to Korea. I think that you haven't really yet had the kind of populism that has struck the United States or certain countries in Europe, but certainly problem of corruption is there. Failure to deliver there, I would say the failure is more in terms of new horizons for economic growth. Obviously, technology has played a really big role in all of our recent elections. One of the things that I think doesn't occur immediately to people of my generation, I continue to read the New York Times and the FT every morning, and I don't have a TV, but other people my age would be watching television. People under the age of 30 don't do that anymore. They get their information from completely different sources, and I think that shift in media consumption is something that dramatically affects the mentality and the social relatedness of younger people that is really quite different from older ones. And again, the issue of gender is one that continues to be very important. So I would say that this general crisis of trust is something that is broader than this society or the United States or any other society. The failure of people to believe in their democratic institutions and that their democratic institutions can fairly represent them is a major problem for modern liberal democracy. And in the panel discussion, we can perhaps get into a discussion of things that might reverse some of these trends and build trust. I think that's absolutely critical if our democracies are going to survive. So with that, I'll stop talking. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Francis Fukuyama, for the intriguing presentation as well as the food for thought for our discussions. 네, 정말 재미있는 주제로 강연을
That was such an interesting topic that you covered during the panel discussion session, and we will continue with the discussions on the topics that he raised.
다음
Next week's speech is going to be given by Professor Kathy Kramer from the Political Science Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Professor Kramer is a renowned scholar from her innovative research on American political opinions and identity politics. Through her numerous publications, including The Politics of Resentment, she has analyzed the political divide between rural and urban areas in the United States. The topic presented by today is the retreat of democracy, prospect for Korean democracy. Please join in welcoming her with a big warm round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. 안녕하세요. Distinguished guests, old friends, new friends, it's truly an honor to share this forum with you. And this is my first visit to Korea, and I am having a wonderful time. So thank you for your hospitality. It's my honor to share what I know with you today about democratic backsliding in the United States, and to share my thoughts with you about what I think this might mean for South Korea. And I am very much looking forward to the conversation, the panel discussion afterwards, to think alongside with you about democratic backsliding in the US and potentially here in Korea. So when I think about democratic backsliding, there are two main things that I think we should keep in mind. That it takes these two things for democratic backsliding to occur. On the one hand, it takes sentiments within the public that are often generated by the kind of rapid changes that you just heard Professor Fukuyama explain, kind of social and economic changes that cause a kind of discombobulation among some segments of the public, if not the public as a whole. But democratic backsliding doesn't just occur because the public is feeling disgruntled. It takes political leaders to exploit some of the sentiments that exist within the public for their own personal and political gain. So I want us to keep in mind both the public sentiments as well as actions by the political leaders. What I know most about is public sentiment, kind of how it changes over time, and how people are feeling about this particular moment in history in the United States. And so I'm going to share what I know about that and then talk about what it means for democratic backsliding. So I want to start with thinking about how have the people in the United States responded to the kind of massive social and economic change that we've experienced in that country since the middle of the last century. And I want to start by just showing a picture of a typical American family in 1965 enjoying a backyard barbecue together. Now I want to show you a picture of a typical American family in 2025 sharing a backyard barbecue together. If this picture seems a little bit odd, it is because I used AI to generate this, which is part of my point that the change in technology that we've experienced in the United States, as in Korea, is pretty significant since the middle of the last century. You might also notice two people in this photo using smartphones, right? So the technological change has been massive, but there are other changes that are represented in the contrast between these two photographs. One you might have noticed, the family before was a white family. This is a multicultural family, various races and ethnicities represented here. The change in racial and ethnic diversity that we've experienced in the United States is quite significant. So back in 1970, estimates are that about 89% of the American public were people who we would generally call white people. These are people who don't identify as Hispanic and identify as Caucasian. But now, in the 2020 census, that percentage had dropped to about 58% of the public. So a big change in the racial and ethnic composition of the country. There's other changes represented here in terms of gender roles. We've experienced some pretty significant changes in the role of women in the U.S. society, from their involvement, particularly among white women. Their involvement in the workforce has changed dramatically, increased dramatically since the middle of the last century, and that has shown up in the way we organize our families. And obviously, again, this is AI generated, but it's not really clear here what the structure of this family is. We have much higher divorce rates than we had in the past, and so we often have extended families. There's just been enormous social and economic change that has taken place in the country. One other economic change that I want to just wind up this contrast by naming is just this shift toward the knowledge economy has meant a change in the kind of jobs that are given higher status in U.S. society, as Professor Fukuyama touched on in his remarks as well. So it used to be the case that if you were in a manufacturing job, that held a kind of status last century. But in this century, there's less status enjoyed by people in manufacturing trades. And again, we have many more people earning a living sitting behind a computer at a desk these days. So these shifts in these social and economic changes are reflected in what we are now experiencing in a political rural versus urban divide. By this rural versus urban divide, what I mean is that it tends to be the case now that cities vote overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party, the Liberal Party, and our rural communities tend to vote overwhelmingly for the Republican Party, or the more conservative party. This is both a geographic divide, as I just named, where people living in certain types of places vote differently from one another, but it's also become symbolic, because as over time, the Republican Party has aligned itself with kind of a rural dweller image, thinking of the rural communities as the communities of moral traditionalism, and the cities now represent in the public mind the place where of kind of cosmopolitanism, cultural elites. So again, this is both a geographic and a symbolic divide. I started, actually, I want to show you just a brief picture of what this looks like, and you may be familiar. This is just representing that our cities are large cities on the coast, on the east and the west coast, and just for reference here, I'm sorry, I don't think the laser is working, but you can see in the kind of the middle of the graph, which we call the Midwest, Chicago is the large blue dot. Again, just representing that the cities tend to vote for the blue party, the Democratic Party, in the last election, Kamala Harris. So where has this rural versus urban divide come from? Scholars these days point to economic and social change as a huge part of the driver. Meaning that people living in rural areas and people living in urban areas have experienced social and economic change differently. And I want to name 4 respects in which they've experienced that change differently. And these 4 respects have been outlined for us in a recent book by Suzanne Mettler and Trevor Brown, who are political scientists at Cornell University. They talk about the comparison of economic change in these places, in which cities have grown economically since the 1970s, but rural communities have either stagnated or declined economically. The same for population growth. So our cities have grown, our rural communities have either shrank or declined in population. 2 other changes are equally as important, I think: education and racial diversity. So here's a graph of the change in the level of education comparing our urban counties and our rural counties. And what you see here is an increase in education across the country in both types of places over time, between 1970 and 2020, and yet the rate of increase has been much steeper in urban areas than in rural areas. The contrast is perhaps even more dramatic with respect to an increase in racial diversity. So again, this is comparing rural counties and urban counties. You see a steeper increase in the racial diversity of urban counties than in rural counties. But what I want you to notice in this graph is back in 1970, across the country, averaged across the country, rural counties and urban counties were very similar in the percentage of people who we would identify as people of color in the United States or racial minorities. So roughly 11% of the population, again in 1970, were racial minorities. But now in 2020, roughly 1 in 2 people living in an urban county is a person of color, but 1 in 4 in a rural county is a person of color. So you see over time, cities becoming increasingly the place of racial minorities and urban communities becoming much whiter than their urban counterparts. So the result of this has often been resentment in rural communities. As people living in rural communities look around them at the world, look at their county, compare their own communities to the urban centers in their state, the nearby urban centers, and notice or feel in their own lives that things are going on in the cities and their community is being left behind. I want to describe for you what this sounds like when you go to these places and listen to people living there. So about 20 years ago, I started a study in my corner of the world, which is the circle here. This is the state of Wisconsin, and again, what we call the Midwest or the upper Midwest of the United States. I was not looking for a rural-urban divide. I was not studying that. I didn't, frankly, naively, I didn't know it existed. Honestly, most of us did not. And most of us political scientists, I would say, we were not paying attention to it about 20 years ago. But what I did, and here's a close-up map of Wisconsin, this is just for reference to show, this is an urban-rural map of Wisconsin. It's a very rural state, but there are 2 main urban centers towards the southern part of the state. The one in the center is Madison, the state capital, where I live, and the other over to the east is Milwaukee, the main industrial center in the state. And then just for more reference, just south of that industrial center, Milwaukee, is Chicago. And then over on the western part of the state is the Minneapolis-St. Paul Twin Cities Metropolitan Center. What I did was to sample communities from across the state, I think 29 in all, and invite myself into conversations of people who were just meeting like they always do on a regular basis with their friends. I would visit diners, gas stations. Oftentimes, it was before dawn. People were on their way to work, or they were retirees wanting to get out of the house in the morning. And initially, I was just asking them, what are the big concerns in your community? And I was spending time in rural areas as well as in urban and suburban areas. But what I was hearing in the rural areas, even though I've lived in this state pretty much my whole life, most of my life, it was a surprise to me, the resentment I was hearing among people living in rural areas. And this is basically what it sounded like. It was this sense that people like us living in a rural community are not getting our fair share. We're not getting our fair share, they would say to me, of 3 main things. They were saying to me, we don't perceive that we're getting our fair share of money. We don't perceive that we're getting our fair share of taxpayer dollars. It seems to us that our taxpayer dollars are going to the cities and not to our own community. We also feel and perceive that the decision-making power is not here in our community, but it's in the cities. We perceive that the decisions are made in cities and communicated to us, and there's little listening going on to our actual lives. And the third way in which they were telling me we don't get our fair share here in a rural community was in terms of respect. People were saying to me in different ways, the people making decisions that affect our lives don't know us. They don't understand what our lives are like in a small community like this, and they don't actually even like us. They think that we are uneducated and backward and racist, and in all of those ways, they were expressing what I called resentment, this sense that things have shifted in the world, in our state, in our community, and we don't get what we deserve. This is important politically, if you think about it. Again, when you think about how people respond to social and economic change, and you think about the rise of kind of the national populist nationalists that Professor Fukuyama was talking about, it's that there's this growth of this sentiment in the public, right, that is then ripe for politicians to tap into. And in three main ways, I'll say, it's why this sentiment seemed important to me politically. It's fertile ground in many ways for divisive messages, because people were feeling like we are good, hardworking Americans, right? We're doing what we should be. We are doing our best, and we feel that we deserve better. We deserve more, and it seems to us that other people don't have it as hard as we do, and they don't seem to be working as hard as we do. So people are kind of wanting an explanation for why it is the case that they're good people, hardworking people, and they feel like they deserve more, and other people perhaps are getting more than they deserve. It's also, these sentiments are also fertile ground for political gain, I should say, because people were not only thinking about their own lives, but looking around themselves at their communities and thinking, our community used to be thriving. A town like this used to be a great place to live. There used to be jobs. There used to be businesses in the middle of town thriving. Something has happened, right? Our communities are disappearing in many respects. And again, people are searching for a story, an explanation for what has happened in their life. And finally, these sentiments are important politically because they're also fertile ground for someone to say government needs to change in a drastic way and quickly, because people were perceiving whatever government has been doing, it is not working for people like us. It's run by people who don't know us and don't respect us. And government generally seemed to many people to be an urban thing. So in Wisconsin, we had a person run for governor by the name of Scott Walker, who's on the left side of the screen, who tapped into these sentiments very effectively by saying to people, you're right, you do deserve more, and you know what? Public employees are getting more than they deserve. And he used that sentiment in large part, negative sentiments toward the public, a perception that public employees were not working very hard and seemed to be getting high salaries, good benefits at the expense of other people in the public, to become governor of our state. I would not call him a populist nationalist. The other person on the screen, I agree with Professor Fukuyama and his characterization of Donald Trump, our president, in terms of what motivates his policies. And he too, he's a very different politician than Scott Walker, but he too tapped into this sentiment by saying to people, you're right to be upset. But he said it, I would say, argue, in a much stronger fashion than Scott Walker. He said to people, you should be angry. You do deserve more. And there are people who are getting more than they deserve. And he gave people targets of blame and very much used his ability to read the room, read the audience, and tap into those sentiments that people were feeling resentful and to electoral gain. Well, I've said a lot about the rural versus urban divide, but where I'd like to go now is to explain that our rural versus urban divide, in my mind, is a very clear example of how sentiments that have arisen in the wake of massive social and economic change have then been used politically in the United States. But this divide is part of a bigger divide that has happened politically. It's a part of a bigger divide in how people in the United States have made sense of economic and social change, in part aided by our political parties. Here's what I mean. My colleague, Larry Bartels, who's also a political scientist, who's now at the university, Vanderbilt University, He and I have used a panel study of people who were high school seniors back in 1965 to try to understand how people in the United States have responded politically to the social and economic changes that we've experienced. So this is a sample of people, a national sample, nationally representative sample of people who were high school seniors in 1965 who were re-interviewed until the time they were about 50. And so Professor Bartels and I reanalyzed that panel data, but we also went back and did in-depth interviews with a small sample of the original sample when these folks were in their early to mid-70s to try to understand how they made sense of the change that they have experienced over time. And what we found is that people who were more accepting of the social changes that have taken place in the United States tended to be people in this sample who went on to college to earn a 4-year degree. They also tended to be people who went to high school back in 1965 in communities with higher household incomes and a higher level of education. People who were less accepting of social change in this representative panel of people who graduated from high school in 1965, they tended to be people who did not go on to college, and they were also people who did not go to high school in a place with higher household incomes and higher levels of education. This, we think, represents the roots of the new political cleavage that we are experiencing in the United States, where now we have a Democratic Party, which is basically the party of more highly educated people, more cosmopolitan cultural liberals, as opposed to the Republican Party, which is the party of more morally traditional voters who tend to live in, are not necessarily themselves, but they tend to live in places that are less affluent and less education communities compared to the folks who lean toward the Democratic Party. I want to take a pause now to say, you might be wondering, how is that a threat to democracy? Those not in and of itself is not necessarily a threat. But I want to reiterate that the threat to democracy happens when leaders are willing to undercut democratic institutions in order to achieve personal or political gain, to prevent the other side from winning, very much as Professor Fukuyama just explained. Right? Democratic backsliding occurs when political leaders are willing to undercut the rule of law, are willing to undercut democratic institutions to undermine or to prevent the opponent from winning. And because our social cleavages, the way we've experienced social change in the United States now lines up so clearly with the political parties. They're kind of so-called winners and losers, right, of this shift to the knowledge economy and other shifts that have taken place. It means that people in the United States, in part encouraged by our political leaders, see the other side as morally corrupt or almost evil in some respects. And so they will make an argument that it is acceptable to undermine democratic institutions with the purpose of preventing the other side from winning. What does this mean for South Korea? Well, I do think that you've had some threats to democracy recently, but there are some positive signs in the way your country has responded. So clearly sending signals that calling for martial law is not acceptable is very promising. But still, I know that there are worries still underfoot in terms of things like threats to press freedom, for example. Another thing, though, is that I know your rural versus urban political divide is not as extreme as we are experiencing in the United States. It tends to be the case that systems that are more majoritarian, kind of small party systems, we tend to see a more significant rural versus urban divide. I mean, the US, UK, and Canada, we tend to see a more extreme rural versus urban divide in those countries. Now, Korea, obviously, I know it's in many respects, it is a two-party system, even though weakly institutionalized, a multi-party state. So there are some concerns there as well. And I think some of the questions that Professor Fukuyama raised in terms of, for example, the provision of infrastructure, are there signs that the government is meeting the needs of the people in Korea? Are there ways that that might be improved so that people who are feeling or experiencing a loss or feeling left behind by the shift to the knowledge economy now feel are helped to feel that the government is actually on their side and helping them out? And I wonder if there's a way for the government to do this, to sort of meet the needs of the people without demonizing particular social groups in society. I too see gender as an issue in countries facing a threat from authoritarian populist leaders. It's a common tactic of populist leaders to exacerbate gender divides. I think it's possible for political leaders to help people understand the changes that are happening in society without pointing a finger of blame at particular social groups within society. Finally, oftentimes populist candidates rise to power by claiming that they are going to be the ones to listen to the people, to truly represent the people. I think it's worthwhile to question those arguments when they are made and to question the ways in which the Korean government is or perhaps is not actually listening to people in the public. My sense is that most democracies can improve in this respect. Certainly the United States can improve in that respect in terms of listening to the public as well. Thank you so much for your attention, and I very much look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor. Please take a seat on the stage. Thank you. I think it was a great segue into our panel discussion. 네, 발표의 마지막 부분이 이제 바로 토론의
The last part of her presentation naturally linked the presentation to the panel discussion session. Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. Now we will move on to the panel discussion session. After the discussion, we will also have a Q&A session with the audience. So if you have a question, please write it down on the memo and give it to our staff member. Now let me invite Professor Fukuyama, Professor Kramer, Director Shin Gi-uk, and Professor An Byung-jin to join us for the panel discussion.
The chair of the second session panel discussion is Director of the Asia Pacific Research Center, Shin Gi-uk. Mr. Shin is a renowned scholar who has conducted extensive comparative research on contemporary Korean politics and society, North Korean issues, and Korea-US relations. He is currently also serving as a founding director of the Korean Studies program and Taiwan program at Stanford University. The panelists will be Professor An Byung-jin from the Future Civilization Institute at Kyung University. Professor An has been conducting in-depth research on American and Korean politics and has also been active as a columnist and commentators for major domestic media outlets. I think we are ready on the stage. Let us begin the session by handing over the microphone to the moderator. Please welcome with a big round of applause.
Thank you for a very kind introduction. I'm very happy to be back to this Munhwa Future Report. Actually, I attended the second one in 2019. And thank you, Chairman Lee and other people for the paper. And actually, I have long-standing ties with the newspaper. I was a guest columnist for a few years, for the paper, in the past. So today, I think we have a lot of issues to discuss. But I think as in the previous panel, let me turn to first Professor An Byung-jin, who can make some comments on two excellent, very stimulating presentations by Professor Fukuyama and Kramer.
Yeah, it's really a great honor to be here as a discussion. And because of time limit, I just jot down memo right after the summit, and I'm just gonna read aloud. I just got 5 minutes, so I'm gonna read as fast as I can. Here, I would like to comment on some narrow and some previous view on U.S.-South Korean summit and the future political outlook for the U.S. and South Korea. Some pundit in the U.S. and South Korea still misunderstood President Trump and President Lee Jae-myung. I would like to briefly share my thought. The first misunderstanding is the view that Trump is synonymous with J.D. Vance's MAGA worldview and Elbridge Colby's hawkish stance on China. The so-called purge message controversy just before the summit also gave rise to the misconception that this view is justified. However, the summit confirmed the strong trust between the two presidents so far. This is because Trump's primary concern, unlike Vance or Colby, is to leave a great legacy like former President William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt. As demonstrated by the emphasis on shipbuilding and Kim Jong-un during the summit, Korean Peninsula is of utmost importance to Trump. Therefore, when analyzing the Trump administration, it's important to analyze not a single perspective, but a mixture and even confusion of various perspectives, such as Trump's obsession with his legacy and Nobel Peace Prize, his transactionalism, and the ideological perspective of Vance and Colby. To use a metaphor, Trump has a confusing identity in an era of hallucination and doppelganger. If we try to understand this simply within the existing framework of international political theory, we will inevitably fail to predict Trump's future action. The second misunderstanding is the belief that Trumpism will consistently guide the United States and world for the next 5 years and beyond. This is a deterministic understanding, I think. I believe the upcoming midterm election in 2026 and presidential election in 2028 will be important turning point. All decisions made by the White House at this moment are filtered through the prism of the midterm election. South Korea needs to analyze possible scenario in advance regarding the Trump response to the midterm election and Trump's new move after the midterm election. And we also must prepare mid to long-term diplomatic strategy that take into account the possibility of the U.S. Democratic Party shifting toward the revised version of liberal internationalism. I recommend that Lee Jae-myung administration prepare various scenarios through a presidential committee following a successful summit. There are also misunderstandings about South Korea's new president in both U.S. and South Korea. I recently served at the State Affairs Planning Committee of the Lee Jae-myung administration to help create a 5-year plans. Keyword, to accurately understand President Lee, his strong pragmatism and emphasis on people's sovereignty. We need to understand that he's very different from previous conservative or progressive president in South Korea. Recent diplomatic moves by President Lee Jae-myung have exposed uncomfortable feeling of the existing progressive camp. Those who saw this administration as simply a continuation of the Moon Jae-in administration are now very perplexed, very confused. I understand their concern. However, I believe that this pragmatism is overall as a meaningful step for South Korea across party line. If a broader coalition can be formed with moderate, conservative, and progressive within the country to discuss new path and strengthen bipartisan foundation, this could be a new leap forward for South Korea. Lastly, I would like to suggest two things. Two things are needed going forward. First, I hope the Lee Jae-myung administration will go beyond mere pragmatism and contribute to the reinvention of liberal internationalism on a global scale. We need a new foreign doctrine, Lee Jae-myung doctrine, that transcends the existing conservative progressive stereotype. While adapting to the era of pragmatism and national interest, we must tinker with the liberal order through multidimensional cooperation with Europe, Asia, and other regions in areas such as AI, climate, healthcare, digital space, and so on. This is similar to how former President Kim Dae-jung proposed a new universal liberalism that transcends ASEAN, particularly in his foreign affairs dialogue with Singapore Lee Kuan Yew. I call this a Republican internationalism of coexistent co-prosperity. And lastly, Democratic Party in the US and Lee Jae-myung administration in South Korea must create a new liberal vision for the left behind. In Professor Kramer's presentation, she emphasized the importance of the state response to the left behind place and people in Korean society. The Democratic Party in the US tried to do this through IRA, but I think it failed and lost to Trump. In the extreme polarization that AI will bring to the US and South Korea, new liberal vision that transcends AI technological fix is needed. Otherwise, politics resentment that Professor Kramer mentioned will become more pronounced in South Korea Rust Belt rural area. In this regard, Lee Jae-myung administration emphasized the universal society. In Korean, it's a 기본 사회, for the dignified lives of the socially vulnerable. I hope that President Lee and global leaders will raise these issues at the upcoming UN General Assembly in New York in September and APEC Summit in Korea in October. I believe that today's discussion among Shin Gi-wook, Francis Fukuyama, and Catherine Kramer, three eminent scholars, provide rich inspiration for this. And I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you. So let me start with a question for Frank first. So in your presentation, you mentioned weaponization of corruption. And I thought that's a very important issue because on the one hand, you have to address corruption. At the same time, you got to be very careful not to weaponize corruption. And now if you look at Korea today, right now, there has been very intensive and extensive investigation of corruption charges against former officials. So how draw a line between corruption and weaponization of corruption, and how to address corruption without weaponizing? That's my question for you.
Well, I'm not sure.
Yeah, push here, button.
All right, okay, got it. Well, there's obviously not an easy way of doing this. I think that what you ideally want is a really independent judicial system that is able to go after politicians of all parties and show that they're willing to, launch indictments against what they perceive as corruption. Now, I think that the Biden administration tried to do this because they actually indicted Eric Adams in New York, who was a Democratic politician, and this was done under a Democratic attorney general. I think that it becomes very suspicious when the only people who are indicted are of one political party. But, I don't think there's a clear standard because you can invent corruption charges that could be thrown against almost anybody. And I think one of the things that we're seeing now in the United States is that the Trump administration is so willing to use the judicial system in all sorts of absurd and trivial ways. And what that does is, even if they don't win an actual judicial outcome, they still impose big costs on the person being targeted. So, for example, all these universities right now are facing an attack from the Trump administration trying to undermine or trying to take away their research funds from NIH and so forth. They're going to lose every single one of these cases because basically they don't have a single legal ground to stand on, but it costs them so much money and so much reputational damage if they try to fight the administration, that they don't want to do that. And I think there's something similar with a lot of corruption charges that are thrown around. You know that you can't make them stick in the judicial system, but you target somebody and you make that person pay a big cost. If you've been following John Bolton lately, Trump's former national security advisor, they raided his house. I suspect there's no evidence behind this. There's no corruption whatsoever. And I think that when they pursue the case in the courts, they'll discover that there's nothing to this charge. But, in a way, that's not the point. The point is to make Bolton personally pay for lawyers, very expensive lawyers, and, live under the fear of something, bigger happening. And so maybe that's a way of distinguishing. You can tell what's a frivolous charge and what's a more serious one, or you should be able to. And, maybe that's a way to think about these things in the future.
But then how to prevent weaponization of corruption?
Well, I guess this
there's
is...
a temptation, right, among political leaders.
So this is, I guess, something that gets to the heart of the problem with modern liberal democracy, which is that liberal democracy depends on a rule of law, formal laws that define acceptable and unacceptable behavior. But the successful functioning of that system depends on normative values, like trust, like moderation, like a sense of justice. And if you have political leaders that don't act moderately, they don't bring every single charge they can think of against their opponents, then you're going to have a big problem because the legal system isn't going to be able to, really defend people that are actually quite innocent. As I understand it, one of the problems right now with the Democratic Party in this country, and one of the reasons actually that President Yoon got so upset with them when he was president, was they were using every single instrument they could, to basically impede his agenda. And they didn't have to do that. I mean, you could have gone into it with a different normative sense of moderation where, yes, we could take these actions, but, the guy won an election, so we have to let him govern. And I think if you have a political elite that doesn't have these values, I'm not sure that there's a way to deal with this. And that's what we have in the United States. We have a president that's willing to use any possible tactic he can to get at his enemies. And the system just isn't designed to handle something like that.
Okay, so that leads to my question for Kathy. You talked about politics of resentment. And you are right that there is no strong rural-urban divide in Korea, but still there are many sources of resentment, like male resentment or against establishment and so on. Then also there are temptation for political leaders to mobilize their resentment for political gain and demonizing the other side as evil. So, same question, how to prevent or at least moderate this politics of resentment?
Well, honestly, I think my answer is going to be very similar to Professor Fukuyama, and it takes a certain level of leadership, like good leadership, at some level to resist that temptation, because the fact of the matter is human psychology is such that us versus them thinking is very powerful, very mobilizing, and it has been used in politics since humans were doing politics, right? But in contemporary society, and the threats that we're experiencing to democracy right now, it's not the only option. You can imagine a political leader rising to power at least I can, by making people feel good. Making people feel good about their country, making people feel as though it's worth it to come together in just the simple respect of believing in one another, of reestablishing the trust that Professor Fukuyama talked about. So my answer is basically, it takes humans behaving themselves to get over this kind of politics. And I recognize that that is very difficult because there is so much to be gained by using these tactics. They're very useful, they're very effective by giving people who are feeling a kind of pain, a story, a target of blame. I am asking a lot of political leaders, but on purpose.
So BJ, do you have any thought, especially regarding Korea?
Well, I'd like to underscore the concept of integrity. It's very difficult to translate in Korean, but as you all know, in the past, no matter what, conservative or liberal, integrity is the most essential thing, right? And as far as I remember, founding fathers in the United States, they not only underscore the institution, they also underscore the virtue. But the problem is, in Korea, we not, in our educational system, in political system, we are not trained as cultivating our integrity. So I think we need a lot of things to do in terms of educational reform and try to have a good leadership. When I was studying in the United States, I thought designing sophisticated institution matters a lot. But I'm getting old. I'm retiring in 8 years.
So you're youngest here.
I know. And I think human factor is more important than institution, I think.
Okay, so once again, we are collecting questions. So, feel free to write either in English or Korean. I can read both of them. Let's go back to the impact of technology, that Frank touched. We know that, technology, can be double-edged sword. It can go either way. But now, looking at the development of AI, I'm quite concerned because it's really going very fast. And then now, in this contest between democracy and autocracy, so is AI going to help more democracy or autocracy? Or it depends on, let's say, 5 years from now, how, already you mentioned that there are many, strong authoritarian leaders, and probably, Trump may be gone in 3 years, but I guess Xi Jinping, Putin, Modi, they may last longer, and then this, new technology will be available, for them. So that gives me some concerns. But I'd like to get your opinions. It's a big question, of course, yeah.
Well, I have a policy of not answering questions like that because I just don't think that it's possible at this juncture to really predict what the long-term impact of this powerful technology is going to be. I think it's a little bit comparable to asking somebody in the 1880s, shortly after the invention of electricity or the discovery of electricity, what do you think the future of electricity is going to be? Who would have thought of all the stuff that's happened, computers and, everything else that depends on electrical power? So, I think that AI is a tool. It will be very useful for a lot of economic purposes. I think that my suspicion is that some of the fears of AI in terms of the labor market are overstated because as a tool, it is going to be disruptive of labor markets. It is going to displace a certain amount of work that is done by human beings. But every technology that we've experienced in the past has done that, and then societies figure out how to adapt to it. And I think that most technologies are neutral. So, you can use electricity to electrocute people, or you can use it to light their homes. It really depends on, the intention of the person making use of the technology. And I think there'll be an interplay between the good uses and the bad uses, or a dialectic situation that will go on for some time. And it's really hard to know who's going to win, that struggle in the end.
So Kathy, yeah.
Well, I very much appreciate Professor Fukuyama's policy of not answering such questions, but I agree with everything he said. And I'll just add one thing, that I am concerned about what it means for democracy. And in one case in particular, I'd like to voice, and that is, it complicates and currently, I think, endangers the connection between people and their governments in the following respect, that because it is so easy now to create content that isn't necessarily reflective of a given individual's thoughts, there are now lots of reasons for people serving in governments to not believe any kind of communication they're getting from members of the public. So when AI is just disrupting the ability of policymakers to believe that they are actually hearing from the public, and so an honest response, a reasonable response, is to just not pay attention to it. But I'm thinking in particular at the federal level, there's what we call a notice and comment period in the policymaking process, the implementation of laws, that historically has been a time for people in the public or interest groups in the public to communicate to the federal government what they think about the shape that a policy should take in its implementation. And now that's just being flooded by AI-generated material, and so people writing the rules and procedures are, my understanding, are not paying much attention to those comments anymore.
Just make a comment on that, because that's actually something that I've been paying some attention to. For a big rule, so we have this thing called the Administrative Procedure Act, where if a bureaucracy makes a rule change, the act says you have to put it in the Federal Register and allow people to comment on it. And I think that one of the problems is that for really big rule changes, you get so many comments that it's really impossible without AI to actually process that. We actually have had a very bright computer science student at Stanford look at the notice and comment for one of the Federal Communication Commission. They wanted to do a rule change about net neutrality, and the FCC got 1.5 million comments. And he used a big data AI program to sort through those comments, discovered that about 15% of them came from one single source. And then the AI was able to actually categorize the different types of comments it got in a way that actually simplified the job of the federal agency to actually try to understand what was really being said. So this is why I think there's this kind of tug of war going on between people that want to misuse AI and people that actually can turn it to positive uses. And this is one in which I think there's actually a big future for, in a mass society, you're dealing with such large numbers, and to really be able to pick out the signal from the noise in that kind of environment, it may need AI. Human beings aren't capable of doing something like that.
Okay, so, yeah.
Actually, I think it's 10 years ago when Larry Kurzweil coined the word singularity point. Many people made fun of him. They just regard it as kind of science fiction movie. But now, nobody dared to challenge him. because a lot of things is changing. And problem is, in America, nobody could challenge the Magnificent Seven. And in China, nobody could challenge the digital Stalinism. So maybe I'm too pessimistic, but my friend called me a Dr. Doom. And I think we need counterbalance. Even Lisa Khan during Biden administration, who was an expert in anti-monopoly, she failed. So we need a very strong counterbalance against digital Stalinism and Magnificent Seven. But it's uphill battle.
Turn to this crisis of trust and democratic backsliding in the United States. Historically, the U.S. was a defender of liberal democracy against fascism and communism. However, as you discussed, today U.S. itself is going through democratic backsliding and losing its respect and leadership in the global community. So when I come to Korea or Asia, people asking me, what's going on in the United States? Because we are looking up to United States, but maybe not anymore. So do you think U.S. can restore the trust and leadership in preserving liberal democracy in the global world? Of course, it's a big question, but still we'd like to get your opinion. Yeah.
Well, I think that it is possible, but it's also the case that I don't think it can happen unless there's a change in the understanding of what it means to be a liberal that wants this liberal order. I think this is clearest in the realm of the economy, where we went through this so-called neoliberal period, where liberal principles were pushed to extremes, and that created, part of the resentment that Professor Kramer was talking about, where a lot of people were left out by the big changes that were going on in the global economy. That's when a lot of these rural communities were devastated by outsourcing and so forth. And I don't think anybody wants to go back to that kind of a system. The Biden administration did not. I mean, it was now going to return to industrial policy to make sure that, China didn't precipitate a third, major economic shock and, again, devastate American communities. So that's part of it. The harder part, I think, has to do with the cultural side, where there's a lot of resentment that has to do exactly with the sorts of changes in racial the racial makeup of the country and, the kinds of different practices that people in cities have versus people that live in rural areas. So I don't know. I throw the ball to your court.
Yeah.
Well, this feels like one of the types of questions Professor Fukuyama typically says he will not answer. But it's a little hard to say. I clearly, if the United States could get its act together and show in a variety of ways that democracy was not only persisting but thriving, that I think that would be enormously helpful to democracies around the world. Because if we continue a decline away from democracy, I mean, the world is watching, right? So I guess your question answers itself, that yes, that what happens in the US is going to have implications for democracy elsewhere. And I think one thing it will do is give leaders in other parts of the world a decline of democracy in the United States would be fuel for arguments that a different kind of system or a different kind of leader is appropriate. So, yes, the United States needs to get its act together.
What?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I just might add that according to the Farid Zakaria, the commentator in CNN, he thinks America is not a one nation. He thinks Denmark and Saudi Arabia coexist within one country, according to him. And I guess he's right. It's very difficult to coexist in one country when it comes to cultural aspect. So again, I'm a little bit pessimistic. I don't know.
So something else?
I mean, I guess the path towards the democracy fixing itself is an election. You know, there's one historical precedent. So in the late 19th century, there was a big divide between the Republicans and Democrats. The position of the parties was flipped at that point. So the Republicans represented the urban, progressive, business-oriented party, and the Democrats were the party of small farmers, rural people, people in the South. And they kept trading places. The country was very polarized until the 1896 election that brought William McKinley to power. And the Democrats then ran the country, the Republicans then ran the country for the next 3 presidential terms. And that was sufficient to bring about all of the changes of the progressive era, where they established many key federal institutions for the first time, the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate the new railroads and so forth. And it's as if the country had been trying to make up its mind through the late 19th century. Are we still this backward-looking rural society, or are we a forward-looking internationalist, you know, business-oriented society? And they made up their mind in one election. And it does seem to me vaguely powerful, possible that at some point some leader is going to come up with a formula like that, which says, okay, look, we really have to choose between, you know, these two visions of America, and our interest clearly lies in the more internationalist one, and that's the one we're going to try to get back to.
Okay, so we don't have that much time left, so let me ask one, final question, maybe for all of you. So, which is what will happen to the U.S. and the world after Trump? Because I don't think he can run for a third time. So, he'll have to leave his office in a little after 3 years. And we know from history that even after leaders like Hitler, Stalin, Mao were gone, their ideas and followers didn't just disappear. They outlived the original leaders, with a little Hitler, little Stalin, little Mao popping up around the world. And likewise, we have already seen the emergence of what they call little Trump, right? Maybe J.D. Vance in the States, Italy, Netherlands, or you could even argue some people in this country as well. So what do you think American politics and the global order look like once Trump himself is gone? Or do we have to live with a long-lasting legacy of Trump or Trumpism?
Well, I don't think the world is ever going to go back to the way it was before 2016. I think too much has changed. And then, I guess my feeling about this is the following, that there's this period from the global financial crisis, from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the global financial crisis, where the United States was the dominant power. At that point, the American defense budget was as large as all of the other defense budgets of every other country in the world, right? And the United States was dominant militarily, politically, its model was respected, economically and culturally. And I just think that that was a really anomalous period in history. If you look back, at Europe or, go all the way back to the Middle Ages, it's very unusual to have one country that was that hegemonic. And it's not a natural situation because power really should be distributed much more evenly across the world. And so we've now kind of reverted back to a much more multipolar system, which I think is in many ways a good idea, because I don't think the United States used its power very wisely in that 20-year period. We invaded Iraq, we had this global financial crisis, we made a lot of big policy mistakes. And so it may be not so terrible if we do go to a more multipolar world where, the distribution of power between China, Russia, Europe, the United States may actually constitute a little bit of a check on the ambitions, of any one of those, power blocks, and will be, could settle down into a more stable system. But, who knows?
Kathy? Yeah.
That's very helpful. The only thing I'll add to that is, even though so much of the burden of positive change lies with political leaders, I do think it is the case that when political leaders give voice and kind of foment the sentiments of resentment in the public, you're absolutely right, Dr. Shin, that it's not just going to evaporate if a different kind of leader comes to power, right? There is now online networks of people sharing conspiracy theories and ideas about their grievances that need some kind of outlet, not necessarily to acknowledge these sentiments as good for the whole of the country, but they are expressions of discontent with their lives that needs to be acknowledged. And so policies need to address the kind of disruption that people are feeling, not just people who are giving them voice through conspiracy theories, but people across the public. So it will take, good leadership and also good policy, I think, to really help humans adjust to the major changes that we have experienced.
So
Briefly. As a political scientist who major in American politics, I am paying attention to J.D. Vance. I'm quite worried about his chance being elected in 2028. Every American president election in these days are critical election. And if J.D. Vance being elected, it's going to be very dangerous. Trump is just capricious, and he doesn't have any ideology, but J.D. Vance, many PayPal mafia whose name is Peter Thiel, Alex Karp of Palantir, they are supporting him, and their vision is very, very dangerous. So I wish liberal and moderate conservative in America have a coalition fighting against that kind of extreme left or extreme right. Yeah, I wish.
Okay, so I was hoping that we can end our discussion with good notes or promising notes, but I guess we couldn't escape from discussing challenges. But still, this kind of public dialogue and civic engagement is very, very important to preserving liberal democracy. So I think for that, I really appreciate Munhwa Ilbo for hosting this kind of excellent dialogue. And then thanks for staying for long. And then hopefully all of us can continue to engage this kind of dialogue. So I'd like to thank our speakers and discussants, and all of you, and have a great evening. Thank you. 감사합니다.
And thank you to our moderator and the speakers as well as the panelists. 네, 자리로 모시겠습니다. Please return to your seats after the discussions. 네,
This concludes all of the sessions, including the panel discussion sessions. Please join me once again in a round of applause for all of our speakers and panelists. Held under the theme of the trajectory of Trumpism and Korea's choices, Culture Future Report 2025 has been an occasion to reflect on the political and diplomatic challenges that we face amid rapidly changing global dynamics and to consider Korea's future strategies together. I would like to extend once again my deepest thanks to all of you for sharing your valuable time with us today. With this, I would like to officially conclude the Culture Future Report 2025, hosted by Munhwa Ilbo. I look forward to seeing you next year again at this forum. Thank you.